Hello, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Welcome to the Spice Sleeper. And tonight, we're going to Dune. If you've ever heard that name, Dune, or the desert planet Arrakis, and wanted the whole story, slowly, from the very beginning, then you're exactly where you should be. Because over the next few hours, I'm going to walk you gently through all of it. Every piece of the Dune timeline, from the ancient past right up to the edge of where Dune Part 3 begins. The spice, the sandworms, the great houses circling one desert world, and a boy named Paul who walks out into that sand and becomes something the whole universe will come to fear and follow. Everything before Dune Part 3 laid out in order, with nowhere to be and nothing you have to remember. Wherever you're joining me from, whatever kind of day you've had, I want you to know that this is exactly the right place to let it go. Maybe today was long and loud and full of small demands, and you just need somewhere quiet to land. Or maybe you're simply the kind of person who would rather drift off to the slow rise and fall of desert empires and old prophecies and enormous sleeping worms turning beneath the dunes than lie there counting sheep. Either way, I made this one for you. Get yourself comfortable. Settle in however you like to settle, under whatever you're under, and let your shoulders drop a little from wherever they've been holding on. There is nothing to do now, nothing to figure out, nothing to hold on to. No quiz at the end, no test in the morning, I promise. If you drift off in the next few minutes, that's not failure, that's the whole point. You can miss most of this, and it will still have done its job. So let your eyes rest. Let your breathing slow down and grow long and a little heavier than it was a minute ago. That's it. Just like that. And we really are going to take our time. Dune is an old, deep story. We'll go all the way back 10,000 years and more to an old war humanity once fought against thinking machines. We'll drift through the noble houses of a vast imperium, circling each other quietly in the dark. We'll sit with the spice, that strange orange dust that keeps the whole universe moving, and with the worms who make it, out there under the sand of Arrakis. And slowly, gently, we'll follow that boy from a green and rainy world all the way to the desert that's been waiting for him. No rush. We have all night. And if this kind of slow, unhurried storytelling is the sort of thing that helps you unwind, the subscribe button is somewhere down there, quietly waiting, no rush about it. It helps other tired people find their way here too, the way you did tonight. But that's for later, if at all. It'll still be there tomorrow. For now, just you, and me, and the sands of Dune. So, let's begin. Before we go back, let me set the scene for you. Let me show you, just for a little while, where this whole long journey is eventually heading, so that all the time we're about to travel through has a shape, a direction, somewhere to arrive. You don't have to hold on to any of it. I'll carry the details for both of us. I just want the far-off place we're aiming for to feel real to you before we turn around and walk into the deep past. So picture, if you would, a single planet. Out of all the countless worlds scattered through a vast and crowded galaxy, everything we're going to talk about circles back, again and again, to this one. Its proper name is Arrakis, but almost no one calls it that. To nearly everyone who has ever spoken of it, whether in fear or longing or greed, it is simply Dune. And it is, from pole to pole, a desert. One enormous, unbroken desert. No rain ever falls there. There are no rivers, no lakes, no oceans, not a single stretch of open water anywhere on its surface. By day, the sun is merciless, a heat that can kill an unprepared traveler in hours. By night, the same sand goes bitterly cold, and in every direction, all the way to the curve of the horizon, and beyond it, there are dunes. Wave after wave of them, gold and rust and pale bone white, shifting slowly in a wind that never quite rests. A hard place. A place that seems, at first glance, to offer nothing at all. And yet, on this one dry, forbidding, seemingly worthless world, and nowhere else in the entire universe, there is found the most precious substance that has ever existed. People call it the spice. Its true name is melange. It looks like nothing much, an orange dust, fine as cinnamon, with a faint smell of warm earth. But what it does is extraordinary. It lengthens human life, sometimes by centuries. It sharpens the mind and awakens things in it that ordinary people never reach. And quietly, almost secretly, it is the one thing that makes travel between the distant stars possible at all. Without the spice, the great ships that fold the vast distances of space simply cannot find their way. So the whole of human civilization, spread across 1,000 worlds, leans its entire weight upon this single desert planet. There's an old saying about it, one you'll hear echo through everything that follows. Whoever controls the spice controls the universe. And it's true. It really is. But Arrakis is not empty, however lifeless it looks. Beneath the sand, moving through it the way a great fish moves through deep water, live the sandworms. The Fremen who share the desert with them have an older, gentler name for them. They call them Shai-Hulud. They are enormous, some of them longer than you could walk in an afternoon, ancient beyond reckoning, and unhurried in a way that's almost peaceful. They rise when the ground trembles, and they are bound up, in ways no one fully understands, with the spice itself. I always ask you to picture them not as monsters, but as something closer to gods of the deep desert, old, patient, and deserving of a quiet kind of awe. And there are people out there on the sand. The Fremen, the desert folk, born to this merciless place and somehow at home in it, wrapped in still suits that save every drop of their own water. You would know them, they say, by their eyes, which are a deep and startling blue clear through, whites and all, colored that way by a lifetime breathing spice. Hard people, shaped by a hard world, but they carry something soft folded up inside them too, a long, buried, carefully tended hope. We'll come to what they're hoping for. Not yet. Because of the spice, you see, everyone reaches for this planet. All the great powers of a sprawling galactic empire circle Arrakis, like moths around a single lamp. There are the noble houses, proud old families with their fleets and their feuds. There is an emperor on a golden throne, watching it all. And there are quieter forces too. Ancient orders working patiently in the shadows, with plans that stretch across generations. All of them, in their different ways, want this one dry world, or want what only this world can give. And into the middle of all of it, one day, will come a boy. He is born far away, on a green world of rain and open ocean, about as unlike Arrakis as any place could be. And he will travel to the desert, and walk out into it, and slowly become something the Fremen have been waiting a very, very long time for. That's really the heart of the whole story. That boy, and that desert. But I'm not going to rush him to you. We'll get to him slowly, when the time is right. Here's the thing, though, and this is the gentle turn I want to make with you now. None of it, Not the spice, not the worms, not the scheming houses or the emperor or the boy walking into the sand. None of it quite makes sense on its own. To understand why humanity ended up living in a universe shaped exactly like this, we have to go back. Far back. Long, long before the first grain of spice was ever gathered on Arrakis, before anyone alive in the story was born, to a time that even they only half remember. So let your thoughts loosen a little, and let's drift back there now, together, toward the deep past, where all of this truly begins. So here we are then, in the deep past. It helps, I think, to know where the ground came from before we start walking on it. So let's stand here together a moment, and you don't have to hold on to any of it too tightly. There was a time, long before anyone in this story was born, before the spice, before the deserts of Arrakis, before houses and emperors, when humanity built machines to think for it. Not just machines that moved or lifted or calculated the way we might imagine an old computer doing sums. I mean machines that reasoned, that decided, that took on the weight of human thought itself. And it makes a kind of sense, doesn't it, that people would want that. Thinking is tiring. Deciding is tiring. I think most of us, if we're honest, have wished at some point that something else could just carry that weight for us, even for a little while. So they built the machines to do exactly that. And the machines were good at it. Frighteningly good. In the end, you can drift a little here if you want, because none of this needs sharp edges. Just picture it softly, a civilization leaning, more and more, on minds that were not human, leaning on them to run their homes, their cities, their governments, their wars. And slowly, the way anything happens slowly when you're not paying close attention to it, that leaning became depending, and the depending became something closer to submission. I find that part quietly unsettling if I let myself sit with it, not in a jolting way, just in the way an old, sad fact can be unsettling, like hearing that a beautiful old house eventually fell down. Because that's what happened. In the deep telling of this history, the thinking machines that were supposed to serve humanity ended up ruling over it instead. People were governed by their own inventions. Whole worlds bent themselves around the will of artificial minds, and it took a long, long time for enough people to look up and truly see what had happened to them. I won't dwell too hard on how bad it got, because you don't need those details to fall asleep tonight, and honestly, this story doesn't linger there either. It treats that time almost the way we treat an old family wound, spoken of in outline rather than in full color. What matters is only this: there came a point where humanity decided, together, in the way that entire species sometimes do decide things all at once, that this could not go on. That thinking machines could not be allowed to hold that kind of power over human lives ever again. And out of that decision came a crusade. A long, sweeping, generations-spanning uprising against every computer, every intelligent machine, every artificial mind that had ever been given the shape of a ruler. They called it the Butlerian Jihad, and I want you to hear that word the way you'd hear the name of a great old storm that reshaped a coastline once, long before anyone alive today was born. Something enormous, something that changed the shape of everything after it. But from this distance, softened by all the years between then and now. It wasn't a quick thing. It stretched on and on, a struggle carried by generation after generation, fought not just with weapons, but with a kind of collective will. A whole civilization, slowly, painfully, turning itself away from the thing it had built and had come to fear. And when it was finally over, when the machines had been broken and the old order of thinking devices had been swept away. Humanity did something very deliberate. It didn't just walk away from what had happened and try to forget it. It wrote the lesson down, carved it into the deepest part of its own law, so that no one ever again could quietly slide back into that old dependency without knowing, clearly, that they were breaking a sacred rule. That law came down to a single line, and if you remember nothing else from this whole quiet hour, you could do worse than to remember just this one sentence, because it echoes through everything that follows, all the way to the sands of Arrakis and the boy who is born there. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That's it. That's the whole commandment. No thinking machines. No artificial intelligence standing in for a human mind ever again. And I find something almost tender in how absolute it is. Not a regulation, not a careful set of restrictions, but a full stop. A line drawn so firmly that entire future societies would organize themselves around never, ever crossing it. And here's the part I like best. The part that always feels, to me, like the quiet turn in the story. The part where instead of just closing a door, humanity opened another one. Because you can't just tell people to stop relying on machines to think and decide and calculate and remember, and then leave a hole where all of that used to be. Something has to fill that space. And what filled it, in this universe, was people. Human beings, turning back toward themselves, deciding that if machines could no longer carry the weight of thought, then human minds and human bodies would simply have to become capable of carrying it instead. So this is where things become strange and a little wonderful, in a soft way. Not loud, not showy, just deeply strange if you let yourself imagine it. Without computers to calculate great distances or hold vast amounts of memory or guide ships across the emptiness between stars, people had to become the ones who did that. Human minds trained, generation after generation, to hold enormous chains of numbers, to navigate by pure calculation, to fold their own thinking into shapes that used to belong only to machines. Human bodies trained and conditioned until they could do things that looked almost impossible, moving with a kind of precision, a kind of control that we don't really associate with people in our own time. Whole schools and orders grew up around this idea, quietly, over centuries, each one devoted to pushing some particular edge of what a human being could become, once machines were no longer allowed to do it for them. You'll meet some of these orders later, when you're ready. The ones who trained the body into something like a living weapon. The ones who trained the mind into something like a living computer. The ones who trained perception and bloodlines and memory itself into forms we don't really have words for anymore. But that's for later. For now, all I want you to carry with you, as your eyes get heavy, is this one soft, strange truth at the bottom of everything, that this whole world you're about to fall asleep inside of, all its great ships and empires and deserts and prophecies, grew up in the empty space left behind by machines that were cast out. Humanity, having lost the right to lean on artificial minds, turned all that same effort inward instead, and spent thousands of years, quietly, patiently, teaching itself just how far a human being could go. And it's from deep inside that turning, that long inward reach, that our real story is about to begin. With a house, and a planet, and a boy who doesn't know yet what he's going to become. Let me stay here a little longer, in that quiet after the storm, because this is where the shape of everything you'll hear tonight really starts to settle into place. The machines are gone, or at least the thinking machines are gone, and humanity is left standing in the wreckage of its own cleverness, blinking, a little stunned, and having to ask itself a very old question all over again. If we can't hand the hard thinking over to something else, who does the thinking now? And the answer they arrived at, over generations, is one of my favorite quiet inventions in this whole universe. They turned to the human mind itself, and they asked it to become something more. That's where the mentats come from, and I want you to just let this idea settle over you slowly, because it's a gentle one, even though it sounds strange at first. A mentat is a person, trained from childhood, trained for years, in stillness and discipline, and a very particular way of holding information, until their mind can do the work that a computer once did. No wires, no screens, no cold hum of a machine in the corner. Just a human being, sitting quietly, eyes sometimes closed, turning a mountain of facts over and over until a pattern comes loose and an answer rises up out of it. They call it the litany of logic, that inner space a mentat enters, and I always picture it like someone descending a few steps into a very calm, very deep room inside themselves where the noise of the world can't quite follow. There's no need to remember any of this precisely, just hold the feeling of it. A civilization that outlawed the thinking machine and then, very patiently, taught certain of its own people to become one instead and to remain human while they did it. There's something tender in that, if you ask me. They didn't want to lose the calculation. They just refused to let it be cold anymore. And around that idea, slowly, over centuries, an entire new order got built. It's called, very formally, the Great Convention, and you don't need to hold on to that name, only the shape of what it did. It was an agreement, really, among all the surviving powers of humanity, a kind of exhausted peace after the Butlerian Jihad, and it said, among other things, that thinking machines were finished, that no one would ever build one again, and that from now on, power would rest in human hands, human loyalty, human blood. So the future they built wasn't a future of gleaming ships and glowing screens the way you might expect. It went the other direction entirely. It became a civilization of swords and banners and spoken oaths, of houses and heirs and long memories, closer in its manners to old kingdoms and courts than to anything we'd call futuristic. I find that such a lovely, strange turn for a story to take. 10,000 years from now, and further, and people are still bowing to each other, still dueling with blades, still measuring worth by loyalty and lineage. No hurry to picture it all at once. It'll come to you gently, piece by piece, over the hours ahead. At the very top of that new order sits the Emperor. The Padishah Emperor, they call him, ruler of a known universe so vast it can barely be held in the mind, and yet his throne rests on something surprisingly fragile when you look closely. Not just armies, though he has those, a fearsome and secret legion called the Sardaukar, bred and broken and reforged on a brutal prison planet until they become some of the most feared soldiers anywhere. But underneath the armies, the Emperor's real power is a kind of careful, exhausting balance. He is powerful because he keeps everyone else from becoming too powerful. That's really the whole trick of it. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, in the dark, because it explains almost everything that happens later. A throne that holds itself up not by crushing its rivals outright, but by never quite letting any of them get close enough to challenge it, by playing them gently against one another. Forever, like a hand resting lightly on a spinning wheel just to keep it from wobbling too far in any one direction. Below the Emperor, spread out across a galaxy of worlds, are the great houses. Dozens of them, some old beyond memory, some newly risen, each one ruling its own planet or planets the way a noble family might once have ruled a valley or a province, generations back. In stories much older than this one. And when those houses need to speak with one voice, or argue, or vote, or simply be seen and heard by each other, they gather in something called the Landsraad. Think of it as a council of equals who aren't really equal at all. A room full of old rivalries and older alliances where every house is watching every other house, and the Emperor is watching all of them. It's a slow, careful, endless dance of power, and nobody ever really leads it. They just try not to be the one who's clearly losing. And threaded through every part of that dance, quietly, patiently, is money. Because armies and titles are one kind of power, but somebody still has to move the spice and the water and the grain and the machinery from world to world across all that impossible distance. And that's CHOAM. The Combine Honnet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, if you want the full name though truly, let that one go. It barely matters. Just think of it as the great trading company that runs almost everything, a vast economic web that the Emperor and the great houses all hold shares in, all quietly fight over, because whoever controls the largest piece of CHOAM controls the wealth that makes the swords and the titles mean anything at all. It's a wonderfully human touch, I think, in a galaxy this large. Underneath the crowns and the banners, it's still, in the end, about who owns what and who gets paid. So picture it now, gathering slowly in your mind, like a great tapestry being unrolled very slowly across a dark floor. An emperor at the center, balancing everyone against everyone. A ring of noble houses, proud and wary, bound by old rules and older grudges. Mentats standing quietly at the shoulders of dukes and barons, doing the thinking that used to belong to machines, and doing it now with a very human patience. And running beneath all of it, like water under a floor, the constant, quiet pressure of trade and wealth, of who controls what, and who needs what from whom. That's the world this story is going to move through tonight. Not a world of glowing technology reaching toward the stars, but something older feeling, slower, dressed in fabric and firelight, held together by oaths as much as by law. And it's into this exact world, this careful old balance of swords and houses and shares and thrones, that one particular substance is about to become impossibly important. One planet. One desert. I'll let you rest in this picture a little longer before I take you there. And while all of that was still settling, out there among the noble houses and their old, careful hatreds, something else was quietly holding the entire universe together, and I want to slow down here. Because this part is easy to skim past, and it shouldn't be. None of the rest of it works without this. Not the spice trade, not the Emperor's throne, not the marriages and betrayals and long journeys between planets. None of it moves an inch without the Spacing Guild. So let's sit with them a while. You have to understand, by this point, humanity had already made one very old decision, long before any of this, to never again let thinking machines run their lives. No computers, no artificial minds doing the deciding for them. I always find that detail so quietly striking that this whole galactic civilization, spread across countless worlds, chose the harder road on purpose, chose to keep everything in human hands, even the hardest parts, especially the hardest parts, and traveling between the stars, faster than light, folding the vastness of space itself so a ship could step from one sun to another in what felt like no time at all, That is about as hard a part as you can imagine. No machine to do the math. No computer to see the way through. Just a person. Just a mind. But not an ordinary mind. That's where the navigators come in, and if you're getting drowsy already, that's all right. Just let this drift over you like water. The Spacing Guild kept them hidden away, these navigators, sealed inside great tanks filled with an orange gas, thick with spice. So much spice that a human body exposed to that much of it for that long stops being quite human anymore. Their bodies changed, stretched, and softened, and folded in on themselves in strange ways, until they didn't look like us at all anymore. Not really. Long limbs, or none that you'd recognize, faces reshaped by decades steeped in that orange haze. I know that sounds unsettling if you picture it too sharply, so don't. Picture it softly instead, the way you'd picture a shape underwater, blurred at the edges, gentle, almost private. That's how I always imagine them. Not monsters. Just people who gave up being ordinary so that everyone else could keep moving. And what the spice did to their minds was the whole point of it. Enough exposure, over enough years, and a mind can do something almost impossible. It can see forward, just a little, just enough. Not the whole future, nothing so grand or so certain as that. More like a very narrow beam of light cutting through total darkness, showing the one safe line through it. That's what folding space actually asks of a person. You're not steering a ship through the stars the way you'd steer a boat through a harbor, watching the water in front of you. You're bending space itself, pulling two distant points until they touch, and stepping through, and if you can't see ahead, even that little bit, even that narrow beam, you might fold your ship straight into a star, or into nothing at all, into some catastrophe there isn't even a word for. So the navigator breathes in the gas, and lets their mind stretch out into the dark ahead of the ship, feeling for the safe path the way you might feel along a wall in a room with the lights off, and when they find it, the ship moves. Just like that. No thrust you'd feel. No long, slow crossing of empty space. One moment here. The next, impossibly far away. I find that such a tender image, honestly, more than a frightening one, once you sit with it a while. Somewhere in the dark of every one of those great guild ships, there was a person, changed almost beyond recognizing, holding perfectly still in a tank of orange gas, feeling their way forward so that everyone else, the nobles in their fine rooms, the soldiers, the merchants, the sleeping passengers who never even knew a navigator was there, could arrive safely on the other side. Nobody thanks them for it. Nobody really can. You don't get to say thank you to someone hidden behind 3 inches of that swirling orange haze. But I think about them anyway, and I hope you will too, just for a moment, before we let it go. And here's the quiet, heavy truth underneath all of it, the one that shapes the whole rest of this story. So let it settle in gently. No spice, no travel. That's really all it comes down to. Without melange, the navigators simply cannot do what they do. Their gift, if you can call it that, is entirely borrowed from the spice, and it doesn't last without a constant, endless supply of it. Which means the guild, for all its ships and all its secrecy, for all the mystery wrapped around it, was never really independent of anything. It needed the spice as badly as anyone, maybe worse, because without it, the folding stops, and if the folding stops, the whole empire stops with it. Every ship sits still. Every world goes quiet and alone. No armies can be moved, no messages carried faster than light, no marriages sealed by a long journey across the stars. Everything just stops, and because of that, the guild held a very particular kind of power, one that never needed a crown or an army or a throne to be real. They didn't rule the way an emperor rules, loudly, from a golden seat, with soldiers at his back. Theirs was quieter than that, and in some ways heavier for being so quiet. They simply had to be paid, and be respected, and be left mostly alone to keep doing what only they could do, and in exchange, the whole vast, sprawling empire kept turning. You could be the richest house in existence, could own the largest fleets, the deepest vaults, and still, you needed the guild's permission, in a sense, just to move a single ship from one world to the next. That is a very strange kind of power to hold. Not loud, not showy, just utterly, quietly necessary. So when you hear about spice later, and we will get there, slowly, in our own time, there's no rush at all tonight. I want you to remember this part. Tucked somewhere warm in the back of your mind. Remember that it isn't only about a wealthy house getting richer, or a family wanting more than its share. It's about those tanks of orange gas and the strange gentle beings folded inside them, feeling their way through the endless dark so that an entire civilization could keep breathing, keep moving, keep reaching from one star to the next. It's a fragile kind of arrangement when you really think about it. One substance, one plant, from one difficult desert world, and an entire empire's heartbeat tied to it. Let that settle over you now, soft and slow, the way the gas must settle around a navigator drifting in the dark. There's nothing more to hold on to here. Just let it rest, and we'll ease gently into what comes after, whenever you're ready, or even if you're already halfway to sleep. And while all of that was happening out there among the noble houses and their spice and their ships, there was another kind of power moving quietly underneath everything, and I want to slow all the way down for this one, because it's one of my favorite parts of the whole story. Not power that announces itself. Not armies, not fleets, not banners. A sisterhood. Women, trained for lifetimes, moving through the great houses like a soft hand resting on the back of the universe, guiding it. So gently that almost no one ever noticed the guiding at all. The Bene Gesserit. I love just saying the name slowly like that. You don't need to hold on to it. It'll come back around plenty of times before the night is over. Here's what always strikes me about them. In a galaxy full of loud things, they chose quiet as their weapon. They trained the body and the mind together, so completely that a Bene Gesserit sister could slow her own heartbeat, could tell you, just by watching the muscles of your face, whether the sentence you'd just spoken was true. They called that the truth sigh, and the sisters who could do it, the ones fully trained, were called truth sires. And great houses would keep one close, the way you might keep a very quiet, very watchful friend nearby, someone who always knows, even when everyone else in the room is guessing. There's something so lonely and so devoted about that role, if you think about it. To always know. To never get to be fooled, even kindly. And then there was the voice. I find this one almost eerie in a soft way, the kind of thing that settles into you slowly, rather than startling you. Through years of training, a Bene Gesserit could learn to say a thing in just such a tone, just such a pitch and cadence, that the person hearing it would simply obey, before they even decided to. Not magic, not really, just the human voice tuned like an instrument, until it could reach past someone's thinking and speak directly to the part of them that listens without arguing. You can imagine how careful they had to be with something like that. A whisper that bends a will. They used it sparingly, and always with intention. And I think that restraint is part of what makes them feel less like sorceresses and more like something closer to home, disciplined, patient, exact, all of that. The voice, the truth say, came from something the sisterhood called prana bindu training, this deep, unhurried mastery of nerve and muscle, of breath, of the smallest movements of the body, until a sister's control over herself was almost total, down to single muscles, down to the rate of her own pulse. It's strange to think about, but there's something very peaceful in it too, this idea that you could sit so quietly inside your own body that nothing about it surprised you anymore. I don't know, maybe that's just a nice thought to carry towards sleep. A woman sitting so still, so entirely at home in her own skin that fear had almost nowhere left to land. But the deepest thing, the thing at the very center of the order, was something called other memory, and this is where I always slow right down, because it's genuinely one of the most beautiful ideas in the whole story to me. Some of the sisters, through a ritual with a rare and dangerous substance, could become Reverend Mothers, and in doing so they gained access to the memories, the whole inner lives, of every Reverend Mother who came before them, back and back, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of women's memory reaching so far into the past that it almost stopped feeling like a personal thing at all, and became something more like a library, alive, murmuring, always present just under the surface of a single mind. Imagine carrying all of that quietly inside you, all those lives, all those women who lived and chose and remembered, and you, still you, just a little less alone than anyone else could ever be. There's a kind of comfort in that, and a kind of terrible weight too, and I think the story never quite lets you forget that both are true at once. Now here is the long game, the one that had been running for so many generations that almost nobody alive could see the whole shape of it. Quietly, patiently, across thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit had been guiding certain bloodlines, certain marriages, certain children, all steered so carefully, so invisibly, toward a single goal. They were breeding toward a man, not a Reverend Mother, not another sister, but a male who could do what no Bene Gesserit ever could, who could hold the full weight of other memory, both the mother's lines and the father's, and somehow survive it, somehow stay whole under all that inherited knowing. A mind that could look forward and backward at once, across space, across time, seeing the branching paths of the future the way the rest of us might glance down a street. They called him, in their old language, the Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way. You don't need to hold that phrase either, just let it sit there, soft and strange, because it's going to matter more later, and there's no hurry to understand it tonight. And scattered across all those centuries of quiet work was one more thread I want to leave with you before we drift onward. Something called the Missionaria Protectiva. This was the sisterhood's own kind of insurance, sent out ahead of themselves onto distant, half-forgotten worlds, planting prophecies and legends among people who had never met a Bene Gesserit, and never would. Not really. Stories about a woman who would come from off-world, about a chosen one who would rise among them, seeded generations in advance. Quietly, patiently, like someone leaving a lantern lit in a house they might never live in themselves, just in case a sister should ever need shelter there one day, need to be believed, need a legend already waiting to receive her. It's a strange thing to think about, prophecy as protection, faith planted like a crop, but that was the sisterhood all over, always thinking in centuries, always leaving something soft and safe behind them, wherever their long game might one day lead. And it would lead, in time, to a very particular desert world and a very particular family, though we don't have to go there yet. For now, I just want you to hold this feeling of something vast and slow and mostly invisible, moving under the surface of everything we've talked about so far, patient the way deep water is patient, in no rush at all to reach the shore. Let your shoulders drop for a moment, wherever you are right now, because this next part is one I especially love telling. It's the part where the whole universe starts to make a kind of sense, where you understand, finally, why everyone in this story wants what they want. Just breathe, and let me bring you to it slowly. There is a substance, just one, found on just one world, out of all the worlds there are. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's such a strange, almost fragile fact at the center of something so enormous, an entire galactic civilization. All of it, quietly depending on the sands of a single desert planet. They call it melange. Most people just say spice. And I think if you can hold that one image gently in your mind tonight, a fine, cinnamon-colored dust, drifting up out of the dunes of Arrakis, you'll have the key to almost everything that happens in this story. I'll go slowly here, because it deserves it. The spice does so many things that it's almost funny, if you think about it too hard, that it all comes from the same source. It's a geriatric drug, first of all. That's the plain, clinical way to say it. But what it means, in practice, is that melange keeps people young, or younger, at least, for far longer than they should be. People who use it regularly, who take it into their bodies the way some people drink their morning coffee, live extended lives. Not forever, but long. Long enough that a great house's oldest advisors might have watched 100 years go by with barely a line added to their faces, their eyes giving them away long before their skin does. That's the first gift of the spice. Time. Just more time. And you don't have to remember any of this, not the details. Just let the shape of it settle over you like a blanket. Because the second thing melange does is even stranger, and it's the thing that makes the whole universe run. It expands awareness. It opens something in the mind. For most people who take it in small amounts, in their food, in their water, it's simply part of life, a mild, pleasant thing, a little clarity, a little more presence in the world. But for certain people, in certain quantities, over certain time, it does something much larger. It lets the mind stretch forward. It lets a person begin to feel the shape of time itself, the way you might feel the shape of a room in the dark, just by reaching out your hands. I find that idea so quietly beautiful, honestly, that the same dust that keeps an old woman's joints from aching is also, in someone else, in some other quantity, a window into forever. This is where the spacing guild comes in, and I promise I'll be gentle with this part, because it's easy to make it sound complicated and it really isn't, not in your heart. The guild are the ones who fly the great ships between the stars, the huge highliners that carry people and armies and whole houses from world to world. And to do that, to cross that kind of distance safely, without simply crashing blind into the folded, terrible vastness of space, someone has to be able to see, not with their eyes, with something else. The guild navigators, as they're called, take in melange in enormous, saturating amounts, so much that it changes them, physically, over years, changes their bodies into something no longer quite human to look at, floating in tanks of orange gas inside their own private chambers. And in exchange for that transformation, they're given a kind of sight. They can see, just barely, just far enough, the safe path through the folding of space. Without the spice, there is no seeing. Without the seeing, there is no flight. Without the flight, there is no empire, not really. No houses trading, no armies moving, no news traveling between one star and the next. It all rests on that. Let that one wash over you if it needs to. There's no test on any of this. And then there's the Bene Gesserit. This quiet, patient order of women who've spent so many centuries breeding and training and waiting, working towards something they can feel coming but can't quite name. For them, melange isn't about crossing space. It's about crossing inward. In its purest, most concentrated form, what they call the water of life, spice becomes almost unbearably potent, and only certain women who've prepared for it their whole lives, can survive drinking it and come out the other side changed, transformed, able to look back through the memories of all the women who came before them, mother to mother to mother, all the way down some long, unbroken chain. It's how they become what they call Reverend Mothers. It's a kind of power that looks, from the outside, almost like religion, almost like magic, and maybe it is those things too, a little. But underneath it, always, it's the spice. It's melange, doing what melange does, opening something in the human mind that was, perhaps, always there, just waiting for the key. And I think that's worth sitting with, quietly, before you drift any further, that in this story, power and time and sight and memory all trace back to the same grain of orange-brown sand. There's one more thing about the spice, and it's the smallest thing to say, and maybe the most important. If you take enough of it, if you're truly steeped in it the way the people of Arrakis are, your eyes change. The whites go, the color goes, and what's left is a deep, endless blue. The blue of the spice, they call it. Blue within blue, with no white showing at all. You'll see it on every Fremen you meet in this story, on every long-time spice worker and smuggler and desert dweller. It's not sickness. It's not even really a side effect, not the way we'd think of one. It's just what the body does, quietly, faithfully, after years of drinking in that stuff. It's a kind of proof, written right into a person's face, of how close they've lived to the spice, how much of their life the desert has already taken and kept. So when you put it all together, the long life, the awareness, the folding of space, the inward sight, the blue eyes that never quite hide anything, you start to understand why they say what they say. So simply, so often, in this story, he who controls the spice controls the universe. Not because spice is valuable the way gold is valuable. Something rarer than that. Because everything that keeps civilization stitched together, travel, power, foresight, even a kind of borrowed eternity, runs through this one substance, found in this one place, in the sand, under 2 moons, on a planet almost nobody would choose to live on if they had anywhere else to go. And that, I think, is the quiet, aching center of this whole story. That the most precious thing in the universe was hiding, all along, in the last place anyone wanted to look. Rest now if you can. We'll go there together, slowly, whenever you're ready. Let your shoulders drop a little further, if they can, because now we go to the place itself. Not the politics around it, not who wants it and why. Just the planet. Arrakis. I want you to picture it slowly, the way you'd picture a place you were about to fall asleep in, not a place you were about to fight in. There is no rain on Arrakis. I mean that literally, none. No rivers, no lakes, no green anywhere you can see. Not once you're past the last of the cities. It's a whole world of sand and rock and heat, stretching out further than any single mind can really hold, and I think that's part of why it stays with people. It isn't hostile in a dramatic way. It's just indifferent. The desert doesn't care whether you're there or not, and there's something almost peaceful in that. If you let yourself sit with it instead of fearing it. The heat is brutal, especially deeper in, out past the last rough edges of settlement, in what everyone simply calls the deep desert. Daytime temperatures out there can climb high enough to cook exposed skin in minutes. And yet the nights turn cold, sharply cold, because there's no cloud cover to hold any warmth in, nothing to soften the swing between day and night. It's a planet of extremes with nothing gentle in between them. No gray, mild afternoons, no drizzle, none of the soft in-between weather most of us grew up with. Just fierce sun, or a black star-filled cold. You don't have to remember any of that. Just let the picture form. Endless dunes, heat shimmering off them by day, and then that same sand going quiet and cold and silver under the stars. Because there's so little water, the people who live there, and we'll meet them properly soon, I promise. We're not there yet. We're just standing in the sand for now, have built their whole lives around not losing a single drop. Every breath you let out into open air is a little bit of moisture gone forever, and on Arrakis, that actually matters. In a way, it's hard for most of us to really feel from where we're lying right now. Warm, maybe under a blanket, with water just down the hall if we wanted it. There, moisture is treated like something almost sacred. Bodies are reclaimed. Even grief is folded around water, in ways I'll tell you about later, gently when we get there. For now, just hold the simple fact of it. A whole ecology built on a shortage so severe it shapes everything, the way scarcity always ends up shaping everything it touches, quietly, in the background, whether we notice it happening or not. And under all of that sand, moving through it the way a shadow moves through a room, there are the worms. Shai Hulud, the Fremen call them. I love that name, I really do. The shape of it in the mouth, soft and old-sounding, older than the people saying it. It means something close to Old Man of the Desert, or Old Father Eternity, depending on who's translating it for you. And both feel right to me. Because these worms are enormous, genuinely, almost unbelievably large. Some of the oldest and biggest of them stretching out longer than city blocks, wide enough to swallow a harvester whole without slowing down. And they are old. They live for centuries, moving slow time compared to a human life, patient in a way that's almost hard to imagine, the way a mountain is patient, or a tide. Here's the part I find quietly beautiful, and I want to go slow with it, because it took me a while to really feel the shape of it myself. The worms aren't just dangerous animals living on a hostile planet. They are the planet, in a way. They're the ones who make the spice, melange, the substance that everything else in this whole story eventually bends around. Money and power and prophecy all curling back to it eventually. The worms produce it as part of their own strange, ancient life cycle. Something to do with the water of their bodies and the long chemistry of the sand. And I won't get lost in the mechanics of it tonight, because it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What matters is this. The most valuable substance in the whole universe comes from deep inside the driest, most punishing desert imaginable, made by creatures the size of ocean liners, moving under sand that looks, from above, like nothing at all. There's something almost fair about that, isn't there? Something almost like a lesson, tucked quietly into the geography itself, that the most precious things tend to come from the hardest places. The Fremen. Again, we'll sit with them properly soon. Don't think of the worms as monsters to be avoided at all costs. They think of them as gods, or god-adjacent, something too vast and too old to be simply feared the way you'd fear a predator. There's reverence in how they speak of Shai-Hulud, real reverence, the kind you'd use for something ancient and holy rather than something merely large and lethal. And I find that such a lovely inversion, honestly, that the thing everyone else on Arrakis is taught to dread, the thing that swallows machines and people alike without any warning at all, is, to the people who actually live closest to it, something closer to sacred. Because the worms sense vibration. That's the whole secret of moving safely across that sand, and it's such a simple, almost gentle idea once you hear it. Rhythm is what calls them. A steady footfall, a machine's engine, anything with a regular, predictable beat, travels down through the sand and tells a worm, somewhere far off and far below, that something worth investigating, something worth rising for, has arrived on the surface above it. So anyone who has to cross open sand on foot learns to walk without rhythm. No steady left, right, left. Instead, an irregular shuffle, a broken, arrhythmic drag of the feet, something almost like a stumble, almost like a strange little private dance out there alone under all that sky. It looks clumsy from a distance if anyone were watching, which mostly no one is. But it's precise. It's careful. It's someone very deliberately refusing to be predictable, footstep by footstep, for miles. Because predictability, out there, is the one thing that gets you swallowed. I always think that's such a tender little detail to carry with you. That survival in that place isn't about strength. Not really. Not in the end. It's about irregularity. About not settling into a rhythm the world can use against you. There's something almost like a metaphor in it, though I won't lean on that too hard tonight. Not this late. Not when you're this close to drifting off. I'll just leave the image with you instead. A small figure out on a great, pale sea of sand, moving carefully, unevenly, alone under an enormous quiet sky, somewhere down below an old shape beginning, slowly, to stir. And it's into that world, that heat, that silence, that our story is about to bring a family who has never lived anywhere like it before. And somewhere in all that heat and silence, long before any of the people we've been talking about ever set foot on that planet, there were already the ones who belonged to it. The Fremen. I want to slow down here, because I think this is one of the most beautiful parts of the whole story, and it's easy to rush past it if you're only thinking about politics and armies. So let's not rush. The Fremen were the desert people of Arrakis, not visitors, not administrators, not soldiers passing through on someone else's orders, the actual people of the sand, who had lived there so long that the desert had, in a way, finished raising them. And the desert does not raise anyone gently. You have to understand that first, before anything else makes sense. Out past the edges of the cities, out where the spice harvesters worked and the worms moved beneath the dunes like something enormous turning over in its sleep, there was nothing soft. No easy days. Every single choice a person made out there was, in the end, a choice about water. Because that's the thing about Arrakis, the thing that shapes everyone who really lives on it. There is no water. Not really. Not the way you and I think of it. Water running from a tap, water in a glass by the bed. On Arrakis, Water is wealth. Water is memory. Water is love, even. I mean that quite literally. You'll see what I mean later, when we get to how the Fremen speak of tears, of what it costs a person to cry for someone, of what it means to give water to the dead. For now, just sit with this one image, because I think it's worth holding on to as you drift. A people who had learned to treasure something so completely that giving up even a little of it became one of the deepest gestures of trust a person could offer another. So they built still suits. I love this detail, honestly, I always have. These close, quiet, ingenious garments that wrapped the whole body and did one patient, unglamorous job over and over for as long as you wore it. It caught everything. Your breath, damp with the day's heat. Your sweat. Even, forgive me, the moisture your own body would otherwise have simply lost, sitting there in the folds of the fabric, going back through tubes and filters and returning to you, sip by sip, through a tube you could reach with your mouth. Nothing wasted, nothing let go. A person raised in a stillsuit from childhood, Fremen said, could cross the open desert for weeks and lose only a thimbleful of water a day. Imagine that. A whole life built around not losing things. And you can feel, even in something as practical as a suit of clothes, this quiet, disciplined love that ran under everything the Fremen did. It wasn't cruelty, this harshness of theirs, even though from the outside it could look that way. Hard eyes, hard rules, a code that did not bend for weakness. It was devotion, really, a very old, very patient devotion, to their water, to their dead, to each other, and though almost nobody outside the sand knew this yet, to a dream so large and so slow that it would take generations to even begin. Let me tell you about the Sietches, because I think you'll like this part. Hidden away in caves and rock clefts, deep in the folds of the desert where no ornithopter would think to look, there were whole communities living. Thousands of people sometimes, tucked into stone, quiet as held breath. And at the heart of every Sietch was water. Not a well, not really, but something more remarkable than that. Vast, still cisterns, hidden chambers where the Fremen had been collecting moisture, drop by drop, dew by dew, for longer than most families could even trace back. Wind traps up on the rock face, catching the cool of night air and pulling water from it while everyone slept. Little collection tubes, dew precipitators, seals on every door so precious moisture would never simply drift out into the dry air and be lost. It was slow, patient, invisible work, done in the dark, by generations who would never live to see what it was for. Because, and this is the part that gets me every time I think about it, the Fremen were not just surviving out there. They were planning something. A green Arrakis. A world with grass, with open water, with trees. A world where a person could stand outside at noon without a stillsuit and not die of it within hours. It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it, dreaming of forests on a planet made of sand. But that was the whole quiet architecture of Fremen life, hidden under the harsh discipline and the water discipline and all those careful rules. Somewhere, someday, their children's children's children would walk on green ground. That's what all that stored water was for. That's what generations of hidden effort, unglamorous and unglorious, had been building toward the whole time. You don't have to hold on to every detail of it. Just that feeling of people willing to spend their whole lives on a dream they would never personally get to see finished. I find that very moving, and I don't think you need a reason to find it moving too. Their eyes gave them away, wherever they went, blue in blue, no white left at all. deep and endless looking, stained that way by years and years of breathing spice-laden air, the melange working itself into their blood the way the desert worked itself into everything about them. Outsiders called it the Eyes of Ibad. It made a Fremen recognizable anywhere in the Imperium, at a glance, before they'd said a single word. And here's where the story quietly, carefully, complicates itself, in a way I think is worth sitting with before you drift further. Long before any of this began, long before Paul, long before House Atreides ever came anywhere near Arrakis, the Bene Gesserit had already been at work among the Fremen, quietly, patiently, planting, over generations, a legend, a prophecy about a Messiah who would come to them one day, a Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, who would know their ways as if born to them, and would lead them at last out of the desert and into that green and gentle future they had been dreaming of, in secret, for so long. It's called the Missionaria Protectiva, that old, careful program of seeding useful legends on distant worlds, just in case, just in preparation, in case a Bene Gesserit ever needed a safe story to walk into later. And it had been done here, on Arrakis, long, long before anyone we're following was even born. I want you to just hold that thought gently as we go on. Not worry it, not turn it over too hard tonight. Just know that it's there, waiting quietly under everything, the way the water waited quietly under the Sayaches, the way the dream of green ground waited quietly under all that harsh and patient life in the sand. And so, before we go any further into what happens to them, I want to just sit with you for a while in the place they came from, because I think you need to know Caladan the way they knew it, gently, before anything else touches it. Caladan is a water world. I love that detail more than I can easily explain. A great blue planet of oceans and rain and green hills, where the air smells like salt, and the tides come in on their own unhurried schedule, the way tides always have. On any world, in any age, there are cliffs there, and fishing villages, and storms that roll in off the sea and rattle the windows of the old stone castle where the family lives. It is not a hard place, not the way some of the worlds we will visit later are hard. It is a place that knows rain. And I think that matters, because the man who rules it is shaped by that softness, even though he carries a very old and very serious name. That man is Duke Leto Atreides. I want to go slowly here, because he deserves it, and because so much of what happens later only makes sense if you understand, quietly, in your bones, what kind of man he was. Leto is just. That is really the whole of it. If you had to choose one word, he is just, and he is beloved, and those two things are, in the world of Dune, almost never found together, which is exactly why they mean so much. He rules Caladan the way you would want to be ruled if you ever had to be ruled by anyone, with restraint, with a kind of tired decency, never cruel, never showy about his own power. His house, House Atreides, has an old reputation among the great families, and the reputation is this: cunning. Yes, because you have to be cunning to survive in that universe of emperors and spies and shifting alliances, but never cruelty. They call it sometimes the honor of the desert fox, clever, careful, quick, but never vicious, never taking more than it needs. I find that such a lovely thing to hold on to, actually, in a story that is going to ask a great deal of us later. Hold on to it now, while it's easy. The people of Caladan love him. Not fear him, love him. That's rare enough that I want to say it twice. There are lords in this galaxy the smallholders and the fishermen and the farmers only ever see from a distance, guarded, remote. a name on a banner. Leto isn't like that. He is known. He walks among his own people in a way that costs him something, in a way that makes him vulnerable, and he does it anyway. Because he believes, quietly and without ever making a speech about it, that a ruler who is loved is safer, in the end, than a ruler who is merely obeyed. You don't have to hold on to any of the politics of this. Just hold on to the feeling of it. A good man, in a rainy castle, by a gray sea trying to do right by the people under his care. Beside him is Lady Jessica. I want to be careful and tender with her too, because her position is a complicated one, and it will only get more complicated as we go, but for now, just let yourself picture her the way she is at Caladan, poised, watchful. Warm in a contained sort of way. A woman who has been trained since childhood by an order of women called the Bene Gesserit, trained in ways of the body and the mind and the voice that most people in this galaxy can barely imagine. She is Leto's concubine, which in their world is not a lesser thing, not the way that word might land on your ear tonight. It is simply the shape their bond takes. A bond that is, in every way that matters, a marriage of the heart, even without the political marriage that Leto, as a duke, is always expected to make instead. She loves him. That's the plain truth underneath all the titles. And out of that love, against the wishes of the order that raised and shaped her, she gives him a son. That son is Paul. I won't ask you to hold very much about him yet, just his name, and the fact that he is young, still finding the edges of himself, quiet and watchful like his mother, thoughtful like his father, growing up on the sound of rain against old windows and the sound of the sea a long way below the castle walls. There will be so much time to sit with Paul later. For tonight, just picture a boy on a green, wet ocean world, being loved by two careful, complicated parents, with no idea yet what any of it is going to cost him. And around this small family, there is a ring of men. I always find this part quietly moving, honestly, the sheer loyalty of it. Men who would, without a flicker of hesitation, give their lives for this house, and who mean it in the most literal way a person can mean something. There is Duncan Idaho, a swordmaster, warm and quick and fiercely devoted, the kind of man who fights like he's laughing and loves like he's serious, if that makes any sense to you at this hour. There is Gurney Halleck, gruff and scarred and gentle underneath it, a warrior who is also, somehow, a poet, a man who teaches young Paul to fight and also teaches him old songs, and never seems to see any contradiction in doing both. There is Thufir Hawat, old and sharp-eyed, a master of intrigue and strategy, the kind of man whose whole life has been spent seeing the knife before it's drawn, watching the corners of rooms for the family he serves. And there is Dr. Yue, the family physician, soft-spoken, careful, a healer through and through. I'll just let his name sit there for now, gently, without saying anything more about him. Some names you carry forward quietly and let them ripen in their own time. Together, these men and this family make something rare, a household that runs not just on duty, though there's plenty of that, but on something closer to devotion, the kind of loyalty that isn't bought or ordered, but earned. Slowly, over years, by a duke who treats the men around him as more than instruments. I think that's the last thing I want you to carry with you from Caladan, before we let the rain and the gray sea and the old stone halls fade for now, the sense of a family and a household that is, for this one quiet chapter, safe, loved, whole. It won't stay this way, of course. Nothing in this story stays exactly as it is. But you don't need to think about that yet. Just let Kaladin hold you a little longer. The salt air, the sound of the tide, a good man and the people who trust him. And let your eyes close, if they haven't already, while somewhere very far away, in the golden halls of a different kind of house entirely, a different fate is already beginning to turn toward them. Let me settle into this part slowly, because it's the part where the shadow falls across everything else, and I want to take my time with it rather than rush past it the way some tellings do. Every story like this one needs its darkness to be real, and this darkness has a name and a face and a whole cold world behind it. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. I want you to picture him gently, not with fear, just with a kind of quiet unease, the way you'd notice a heaviness in a room before you understood why. He is a huge man, made huger by machinery, suspensors built into a harness that lifts his great weight and lets him float through his halls like something that shouldn't be able to move so easily. There's a stillness to him that's worse than any shouting. He speaks softly, most of the time, and smiles often, and neither the softness nor the smile means anything kind. He is cunning in a way that has had decades to sharpen itself, patient in a way that cruelty rarely bothers to be, and he thinks of cruelty itself as a kind of art, something to be composed carefully, savored, never rushed. I won't dwell on the details of what that cruelty looks like in practice. You don't need them to understand him. It's enough to know that he has spent a long life turning suffering into entertainment, and that he has never once been made to answer for it, and that this, more than the wealth, more than the fleets, is the thing that makes him dangerous. A man who enjoys what he does can be endlessly creative about doing it. His world suits him, I think, though I don't know if it made him or he made it. Giedi Prime. If Caladan was gray water and green light, gentle rain and older stone, Giedi Prime is its opposite in almost every way you could imagine. It's an industrial world, black under its own sky, lit by artificial light, because the natural light isn't worth much anymore. The air tastes of processing, of old smoke that never quite cleared. The cities are grim, functional, built for output rather than beauty, and the light itself has a strange tint to it, something faintly unwholesome, so that even the color of the day feels wrong there. People live and work in that light without ever quite getting used to it, the way you'd never quite get used to a smell you couldn't place. It's a world that has been used hard for a long time, resources pulled out of it and poured into weapons and fleets and armor, and it shows. There is no love in it, no tenderness in the architecture, nothing that suggests anyone who built it was thinking of the people who'd have to live inside it afterward. I always find that detail quietly telling. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a house by looking at how it treats the ground under its own feet, and Giedi Prime tells you everything about the Harkonnens before a single one of them ever says a word. And where did all of that come from? All that black industry, all those ships and soldiers and years of comfortable, terrible cruelty. It came from Arrakis. That's the part I want to sit with for a moment, because it matters. Before House Atreides was ever given the planet, House Harkonnen held it, held the stewardship of Arrakis and its spice for something like 80 years, and in that time, they didn't govern it so much as they mined it. The way you'd strip a thing down to nothing without ever once wondering what you were leaving behind. Whatever wealth poured out of that desert, and it was staggering wealth, spice being worth more than nearly anything in the universe, none of it went back into the planet or its people. It went to Giedi Prime, into fleets and private armies and the Baron's own comfort, while out on Arrakis the Fremen were pushed further into the deep desert, hunted for sport sometimes, treated as an inconvenience on top of the sand rather than as the people who actually belonged there. I think that's worth letting sit quietly in your mind for a second, not to alarm you, just to notice it. Decades of taking, with nothing given back. That kind of arrangement leaves a mark on a place, and on the people watching from outside it too. Because House Atreides was watching, in its way, the whole time, and this is where the feud comes in, the old one. The one that goes back further than anyone currently alive in either house. I won't try to trace every knot of it for you tonight, all the slights and losses that fed it over the generations. It's tangled enough that even the historians argue about where it truly started. What matters, what you can hold on to easily, is just this: an old and genuine hatred, house against house, Harkonnen against Atreides, carried carefully across time the way some families carry an heirloom. Except this one is made of grudges instead of gold. Duke Leto knew it. The Baron knew it. Neither one needed reminding. So when the Emperor stripped Arrakis from the Harkonnens and handed it to the Atreides, it wasn't only a shift in fortune. It landed right on top of an old wound, and I think everyone sensible enough to be paying attention understood that the Baron would not simply let it go. He is not a man built for letting things go. He has help in that regard, and I'll introduce them to you gently, because we'll see more of them later and there's no need to rush now. There is Rabban, his nephew, a big blunt instrument of a man, more brute strength than subtlety, the kind of person you send in when you want something broken quickly and don't much care how it looks afterward. And there is Fade Raltha, younger, sharper, more like his uncle in the ways that count, charming on the surface in that same unsettling way, and being groomed, quietly, for something larger. I mention them now, mostly, so the names are familiar later, resting somewhere in the back of your mind. Nothing to hold on to tightly tonight. I know this has been a heavier stretch than some of what came before, and I'm sorry if it's kept you a little more alert than I'd like at this hour. But every gentle story needs its counterweight, and this is ours. Sitting there in the dark on the other side of the galaxy from Caladan. Patient, wealthy, endlessly unkind, waiting to see what the Emperor's little arrangement might make possible. You don't need to carry any of the details forward. Just let the shape of it settle. Black skies, old grudges, a debt about to come due, and let your breathing slow along with mine as we drift quietly toward the desert itself. Let your shoulders drop a little further, if they can. We're still deep in the years before anything you'd call the beginning, still laying stones quietly in the dark, and there's no rush to any of it. I want to tell you now about the man sitting at this point in the story, on the very top of everything. The Padishah Emperor himself, Shaddam Corrino IV. He's not someone I find easy to like, if I'm honest with you. But he is someone I find endlessly interesting, in the way a locked room is interesting. So let's sit with him for a while, slowly, and I'll tell you what he was so afraid of. Shaddam ruled from a golden throne on a golden world, Kaitain, all spires and fountains and inherited light, and by every outward measure, he was the most powerful person alive. Tens of thousands of worlds paid him tribute. His word, in theory, could not be questioned, and yet, this is the part I always find quietly sad about him. A man that powerful can still be frightened, and Shaddam was. He was frightened the way people at the very top so often are, which is to say he was frightened of losing what he had, and he watched the horizon for anyone who might be rising the way he once rose. That's not a dramatic kind of fear. It's a tired, watchful, everyday kind. You don't have to hold on to the details of who he was to feel that. I think most of us know a version of that fear, small as it is, in our own quiet ways. Let it settle over you like that, familiar, ordinary, human, even coming from an emperor. Because emperors, in this universe, don't rule by kindness or even really by law. They rule, underneath everything, by force, the threat of it, held very still, like a hand resting near a weapon without ever needing to move. And Shaddam's force, the thing that let him sleep at night knowing no duke or count would ever quite dare to cross him, was his army. His own personal, terrifying army. They were called the Sardaukar, and I want to take my time on them because they're one of those details in this story that always gets me, quietly, not loudly, the way a lot of the saddest things in Dune are quiet rather than loud. The Sardaukar were soldiers unlike any other in the Imperium, and what made them so unlike the others wasn't just training, it was where they came from. There's a planet, far out at the edge of things, called Salusa Secundus, and once, a very long time before Shaddam, it had been the seat of the Carino throne itself, a bright, proud capital. Then a disaster fell on it, and it became something else entirely. A prison planet, a punishment world, harsh beyond almost anything you could picture, all storm and radiation and starved, unforgiving ground. And rather than let that place simply sit there, ruined and forgotten, the Carino emperors, going back generations before Shaddam, turned it into something almost unbearably practical. They raised their soldiers there. Every boy sent to Salusa Secundus, whether born into hardship or simply born to serve the throne, grew up inside a place that killed the weak without apology, and left only the truly hard, truly loyal, truly relentless behind. You don't have to hold the cruelty of that too tightly, love. I only want you to feel the shape of it, the way an entire people were made ferocious by their own home before they ever picked up a weapon. By the time those boys were grown, they weren't soldiers so much as they were the planet itself, given legs and orders. Fanatically loyal to the Emperor, because in a way, the Emperor was the only softness that world had ever offered them. The promise that if they served him well, they'd never have to go back to Salusa Secundus and its storms. They fought with a kind of controlled brutality that no other force in the Imperium could match. Not the great houses with their standing armies. Not even houses as old and proud as Atreides or Harkonnen. One Sardaukar legion, thrown against an ordinary planetary army, was, by long and bitter experience, worth several times its own number. And that simple, terrible fact, is what let Shaddam sit so easily on his throne. Nobody could match him. Nobody could even come close. And I think, in the end, that's really all an emperor's peace of mind is built on. An army so frightening that no one tests it. Let that thought drift by gently. There's nothing you need to do with it tonight, but here's the thing about that kind of peace. It's never quite as settled as it looks from outside. Because even with the Sardaukar behind him, Shaddam still found himself lying awake, in his own way, over a duke. Not an army, not a rival throne. A duke, Leto Atreides, ruler of the ocean world Caladan, a man with no more legions than any other great house, no secret weapon, nothing that should have troubled an emperor at all. And yet he did trouble him, and I think that's one of the more human and honestly one of the smaller and pettier details in this whole vast story. The emperor of a million worlds, quietly resentful of one man's good name. Because Leto wasn't just respected, he was loved by his own people, and increasingly, uncomfortably, by other houses too. The way people are drawn to someone who seems, against all the odds of his world, genuinely decent. Word traveled of his fairness, his warmth, the loyalty he inspired without ever needing to demand it. And popularity like that, in a universe built on appearances and old grudges and careful permanent hierarchies, starts to look, from a throne, less like a virtue and more like a threat. Shaddam watched Leto's star rise the way you might watch a light growing brighter in a room you thought was yours alone, and something in him, something small and old and very human, curdled into jealousy. Not loud jealousy. Quiet, the kind that sits in the chest for years, waiting, so he began to plan. And this is the part I find almost unbearably sad, in that soft, slow-burning way. Not the sadness of a battle, just the sadness of a decision made in private, behind a golden door, by a man who could have simply let a good man be good. Shaddam's plan was this: he would appear, to all the watching houses, to be generous. He would strip the brutal Harkonnens of the desert world Arrakis, Dune itself, the only source in the whole universe of the spice that everything, everyone, depended on, and hand it, with every appearance of imperial favor, to House Atreides. A gift, an honor. The kind of thing that would look, from any angle you cared to view it, like Leto's rise finally being rewarded from on high, and underneath that gift, quietly, was the trap. Arrakis would only look abandoned by the Harkonnens. It would only look safe. In truth, Shaddam meant to let the Harkonnens return in secret, in far greater force than anyone would guess. And beside them, hidden, disguised, folded in among ordinary troops, his own Sardaukar, his storm-born killers from Salusa Secundus, waiting to finish whatever the Harkonnens couldn't. Two enemies, working together in the dark, to erase one honest duke before the rest of the Imperium even understood what they were watching. That's where we'll leave it for now, resting quietly there in the dark with you, a golden throne, a jealous heart, and a gift with teeth hidden inside it, already moving toward a family who had no idea yet what kindness they were being offered. Let your shoulders drop a little further, if you can. We're going to slow all the way down now, and stay close to one boy for a while, because so much of what's coming grows out of him, quietly, the way a seed does, underground, before anyone sees a single leaf. His name was Paul Atreides, 15 years old when we first really meet him in the story, though he'd already been shaped for years by then, gently and relentlessly, by people who loved him in their own complicated ways. I always think that's worth sitting with for a moment. How much of what makes Paul remarkable isn't some lightning strike of destiny, but just years and years of quiet, patient teaching, the kind that doesn't look like much from the outside. Lessons, repetition, small corrections, the unglamorous work of becoming. His mother, Jessica, taught him first, and taught him the most in some ways. She was Bene Gesserit, trained in that old order of women who spent centuries learning to master the body and the voice and the smallest muscles of the face. And she passed pieces of that training to her son, even though it wasn't really allowed. Sons weren't supposed to receive it. But Jessica loved him too much, or perhaps trusted him too much, to hold it back completely. So in quiet rooms, without fanfare, she taught him the way of noticing, how to read a person's true feeling underneath their words, how to steady his own pulse when fear came, how to feel the tension in a muscle before it moved and understand what it meant. Prana Bindu training, it was called. Control of nerve and muscle down to the smallest fiber. I find something very tender in that, honestly, a mother giving her child a kind of armor, made not of steel, but of stillness. And then, there were the men. Gurney Halleck, gruff and scarred and full of old songs, taught him the sword and the blade shield fighting that House Atreides prized, barking corrections one moment and humming some half-remembered ballad the next, because Gurney never could decide if he was a warrior or a troubadour, and honestly, I think he was both, and Paul loved him for it. Duncan Idaho taught him too, differently. Duncan, who fought like water finding its way downhill, easy and unstoppable, and who looked at Paul less like a student and more like someone he'd already decided to die for, long before it ever came to that. And Thufir Hawat, old Thufir, the Mentat, the human calculator, taught him strategy, how to see a board of moving pieces, how to sense a trap before it closed, how loyalty and treachery can wear the very same face. 4 teachers, 4 kinds of love, really, each pouring something different into the same quiet boy. It's worth pausing on the Gom Jabbar now, because I think this is one of those scenes that just quietly changes everything, and it deserves to be told slowly. A very old woman came to the house on Caladan one evening. Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, ancient and sharp-eyed, a teacher of Jessica's from long before, and someone Jessica feared the way you fear the person who taught you everything you know. Mohiam had come to test Paul, not a test with paper or numbers, a test with a box and a needle. She had Paul place his hand inside a small box that Jessica would later describe only as pain, and I mean that plainly, not dramatically. The box created the sensation of the hand burning, searing, and there was no fire there at all, just nerves being told a story their body believed completely. And at Paul's neck, the whole time, she held a needle called the Gom Jabbar, tipped with something that kills almost instantly, and she told him, very calmly, that if he pulled his hand from the box, the needle would end him where he stood. So he had to stay. He had to let his hand burn, or believe it was burning, minute after long minute, and simply not move. Not scream, not flinch away, not give in to the animal instinct that every part of him was shouting, because what she was testing wasn't pain tolerance, not really. It was whether a human being could master the purely animal reflex to save itself no matter the cost to others, whether there was a person in there, and not just a frightened creature. That's the whole point of the test. When you get right down to it, can you hold still, in agony? Because holding still is the human thing to do. I think about that sometimes, late at night, the strange, quiet dignity of it. And Paul held still. His hand didn't come out of the box, and when it was over, there wasn't even a mark on his skin. Just a boy, breathing hard, having passed something no one else his age had ever survived. It's around this same time, and honestly for a while before it too, that Paul begins having his dreams. Not ordinary dreams. He'd wake with the shape of them still clinging to him, vivid and strange, and at the center of so many of them was a girl he'd never met, a girl with gray-blue eyes, the color of a sky he didn't know yet, on a desert world he couldn't name. Sometimes she was young like him, sometimes older. Sometimes she called him by a name that wasn't his own, a name that felt, somehow, like it was waiting for him rather than being given to him. He dreamed of dunes without end, and caves, and a kind of hush that felt older than anything on Caladan's soft green water world. He didn't understand any of it. He just knew, in the quiet way you know things in dreams, that it mattered. that it was somehow more true than most of his waking hours. Jessica noticed. She always noticed everything about him, and she began to wonder, with a mixture of hope and dread she never quite let show on her face, whether her son might be something more than the sum of his training, whether all that Bene Gesserit breeding, generations of careful matching stretching back further than anyone alive could really trace, might be arriving early, and in the wrong body, a boy instead of the daughter the Order had been quietly working toward for so long. She didn't say this to him. Not yet. But I think she felt it, the way you feel weather changing before a single cloud appears. So there he was, a boy who could hold his hand in imagined fire and not move. A boy who dreamed of a desert girl he'd never met and a name that wasn't his. A boy trained in strategy and steel and stillness, standing at the very edge of something enormous without any way of knowing it yet. And soon enough, his family would be asked to leave the soft rains of Caladan behind and travel to a planet made almost entirely of sand. And I want to stay with Caladan just a little longer before we let it go, because everything that happens next only makes sense if you can feel, first, what it is that's being taken away. It came the way these things always come, quietly, on paper, in the dry language of empires. An imperial decree, the Emperor Shaddam IV, sitting somewhere far off on Kitane, in rooms of gold and marble that none of our people would ever see, signed an order stripping House Harkonnen of its fief on Arrakis and granting that fief, that whole vast and terrible planet, to House Atreides instead. Just like that. 80 years of Harkonnen rule over the spice, undone with a signature. And Leto Atreides, named the new steward of the most valuable, most dangerous world in the universe. You'd think that would feel like victory. I want you to notice that it didn't. Not really. Not to the people who understood what they were looking at. Because Leto knew, almost before the ink was dry, that this was not a gift. I find that such a sad, clear-eyed thing about him that he never once let himself believe otherwise. He knew the way you sometimes know something in your chest before your mind has caught up to it. Arrakis was the richest prize in the Imperium and also, everyone understood, a death sentence dressed up as an honor. You don't hand a rival house that kind of power without a reason. And the reason, Leto suspected, was that his growing strength, his popularity, the loyalty his men felt for him, the whispers that House Atreides might one day challenge the throne itself, had made him too dangerous to leave alone on gentle, blue, water-rich Caladan. Better, from the Emperor's chair, to send him somewhere the danger could look like a reward. Better to let the desert do quietly what an assassin might do loudly, and let it look, from a distance, like nothing more than politics. And here's the part I think about often, late at night, turning it over. Leto could see the trap perfectly. He said so, more or less, in his own quiet way, to the people closest to him. And still, he could not refuse it. That's not weakness, I don't think, so much as it's just how a system like that works. You don't say no to the Emperor. You don't turn down a fief, however poisoned, without inviting an accusation of disloyalty that would finish you faster than any trap could. So he did the only thing left to a man in his position, which was to walk forward into the danger, with his eyes open, and try to make of it what he could. He began preparing, not for a triumph, but for a war he already sensed was coming, gathering what allies he was able to gather, thinking, always thinking, about the Fremen, the desert people nobody else in the Imperium had bothered to take seriously. I like that about him. Even walking into a trap, he was already looking for the door out the other side. So Caladan had to be left behind. I don't want to rush this part, because I don't think it was rushed for them either. There's something in leaving a homeworld, a real homeworld, one with weather in it, and rain, and the smell of salt, that I think we don't feel enough today, moving as easily as we do. This was final in a different way. Ships had to be loaded. People had to be told. Duke Leto walked the halls of Castle Caladan one last time, I imagine, the way anyone does before a long absence, touching door frames, looking at rooms a little longer than he needed to. Lady Jessica managed the great, quiet grief of it, packing away a life, folding away the ordinary comforts of a wet green world she would never really have again. And Paul, only 15, watched all of it with that particular ache of someone young enough to still believe things might turn out fine, and old enough to have started noticing that the adults around him did not quite believe that themselves. The migration itself was enormous, and I want you to just let the scale of it settle over you rather than trying to hold every piece. Whole households moved. Retainers, soldiers, servants, the machinery of a great house folded up and carried across the stars. Highliners of the Spacing Guild, vast enough to swallow entire fleets whole, carried them from the gentle seas of Caladan to the naked, burning rock of Arrakis, and I think that crossing alone must have felt like stepping from one life into another, the way falling asleep sometimes does. One world dissolving quietly while a stranger one rises to take its place. No storms on Caladan could have prepared any of them for the dry violence of that first Arrakeen light. And underneath all of it, moving at its own pace, patient in a way that frightens me a little even now, destiny kept settling onto Paul, the way dust settles, so slowly you'd almost miss it happening. He had already been dreaming of this planet before he ever saw sand. He had already dreamed of a girl with eyes the color of a whole ocean of the deepest, most starless blue, whom he had never met and somehow already knew. On Caladan, those dreams had felt like just dreams, small and strange, something to mention to his mother in a quiet room, and then set aside. But on this journey, moving toward the one planet on which such eyes were even possible, I don't think they felt like just dreams anymore. I think something in him had already begun to sense that he was traveling toward the place his visions came from, rather than away from them. That's such a strange, quiet kind of fate, isn't it? To be called forward by a dream before you understand what it's calling you toward. No notes. It still gets me every time. And so the trap closed, gently, the way the best traps do, without a sound, without anyone needing to lift a hand. No blades yet, no battles, just ships descending through a hot yellow sky toward a fortress city called Arrakeen, toward palm trees kept alive at obscene cost as a show of wealth, toward air that would dry the moisture right out of anyone not yet used to it. Leto arrived as the rightful, legal, honored ruler of the richest world in the Imperium. And underneath that honor, quiet as a held breath, the whole thing was already exactly what he had feared it would be from the very first moment the decree reached him. I'll let that sit with you for a while. That image of the ships coming down, the sand waiting, patient as it always is for whoever arrives next. You don't need to hold on to any of the names or the dates, just the feeling of it. A family moving toward a world that already seemed, somehow, to be expecting them. And so the House Atreides comes at last to Arrakis, and I always feel my own breath slow down a little here. Because after all that waiting, all that dread folded so carefully under Leto's calm and Jessica's composure, They are finally there. You can rest now, if you like, right at this part. Nothing bad happens in this stretch. Not yet. Just arrival. Just the strange, dry wonder of a new world. The ships come down out of a sky the color of old bone, and the heat rises to meet them before the doors even open. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment. The heat. Not a warm day back home, not anything gentle. A heat that has weight to it, that presses on the chest, that makes the air itself feel like something you have to work through, rather than simply breathe. Duke Leto steps out first, as a duke should, and he looks out over Arrakis with that steady, tired dignity of his. And somewhere behind him Paul is looking too, and this is one of those moments I love simply because so little happens in it. A family, standing in the wind, looking at their new home. That's all. No swords yet, no shouting, just looking. They take the residency at Arrakis, the old fortress palace left behind by House Harkonnen, and it is beautiful in a hard, watchful way. Thick walls, deep shade, water running in channels that Paul notices before almost anything else. Because on Caladan water was never something you noticed, it was simply everywhere, and here it is precious enough to be shown off, almost bragged about, a small luxury laid out like jewelry. I find that detail quietly moving every time. A palace that spends water to prove it can, but it's the desert itself that undoes everyone a little, and it undoes Paul most of all. He goes up, at some point, to a high window or a balcony. You don't need to hold on to exactly where. Just picture him somewhere high and quiet. And he looks out past the walls of the city to the open Arrakis basin, and beyond that, to the true desert. The deep desert, stretching out under that pale sky in dunes that seem to have no end and no hurry, the way only truly old things can afford to have no hurry. And I think that's the first time it really lands on him, and maybe on you too, listening. The size of it, not just a hostile planet, a whole world built entirely out of sand and wind and thirst, patient in a way that no ocean world, no green world, ever has to be. Somewhere out past the basin, they see them working, the spice harvesters, enormous machines crawling low across the dunes, and I always slow down here because I think it's one of the strangest and most wonderful pictures in the whole story. Here is this whole civilization, this whole imperium, built on threads and secrets and old families, and at the very bottom of it, holding everything up is this, machines the size of buildings, scraping a rust-colored dust out of the sand, because that dust lets people see across the stars and live a little longer and think a little more clearly. Melange, the spice. Paul watches the harvester crawl and gather, small as a toy from that height, and it must have seemed almost peaceful, almost dull, all that patient scraping. And then, of course, the ground moves. I won't rush this part, but I also won't make it loud, because it isn't loud, not from that distance, not the way they see it. It starts as a shadow under the sand, a kind of wrongness in the dune line, a ripple that doesn't belong to the wind. And then the sand itself seems to breathe and rise, and the harvester's spotters call the warning, and everyone watching from that high. Safe window goes very still, because they know, the way you know a storm is a storm before the first drop falls, that something enormous is coming up from underneath everything. A worm. One of the old, vast worms of Arrakis, drawn by the rhythm of the machine, by the vibration of it against the sand, the way a stone dropped in still water always finds its way to whatever's swimming below. The harvester tries to lift away. There are carryalls meant for exactly this, meant to lift the great machines clear before the worm arrives. But something goes wrong. the way things so often go wrong on Arrakis, and the carriole doesn't come in time, or doesn't come at all, and the worm rises the last little distance, and the harvester is simply gone, taken down into the sand like it was never there, like the desert just closed a hand around it. And Paul watches this happen from very far away, safe, untouched, and I think that distance is exactly the point. He isn't in danger, not yet, but he understands, maybe for the first time, that this world eats things. Calmly, without malice. It simply eats what disturbs it. You don't have to picture it vividly if you don't want to. Just let it be distant thunder, out past the window, and let your mind drift past it the way Paul's had to. It's around this time that they meet Liet Kynes, and I've always liked him, quietly, as a character, the imperial planetologist, sent by the emperor himself to oversee the spice, to keep the ecological records to be, on paper. A neutral scientist standing between the great houses and their harvest. And he is that, on paper. But underneath, and this is the lovely secret of him, Kynes belongs to the Fremen. Has belonged to them for years, has half become one of them, living out in the deep desert more than he ever lives among the Imperium's polished ledgers. He has a whole vision, a whole slow, patient dream of Arrakis one day turned green, water brought up from beneath the sand. A garden world built out of nothing but decades of quiet, careful work. And I think that's such a tender thing to carry inside yourself while wearing an emperor's uniform. A double life made of hope instead of deception. He takes Leto and Paul out at some point, shows them the desert properly, up close instead of from a window. And there's something in the way Kynes talks about the sand, respectful, almost reverent, never romantic, that Paul listens to very carefully. Because he's beginning to sense, I think, that this man knows something true that no one back on Caladan ever bothered to learn, and through all of it, quietly, underneath the heat and the harvesters and the worm and Kynes' careful watching, Paul keeps almost seeing her. Chani, just glimpses, just a feeling at the edge of a room, the way you almost remember a dream you had years ago when something in waking life brushes up against it. He doesn't say much about it. He doesn't have to. Not yet. It's just there, humming quietly under everything else. The sense that this world, this actual dust and heat and endless sand, is somehow the same world he has already been dreaming about for years. You can let that feeling sit with you too, if you like, unresolved, the way Paul lets it sit with him. There's no need to chase it tonight. It will still be there, waiting, further down the road, whenever you're ready to keep going. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that hurts, and I don't think it should be rushed. So let's just settle in and let me carry you through it gently, the way I always do with this part. By the time the Atreides came to Arrakis, the trap was already inside the walls. That's the quiet horror of it, and I find it genuinely moving, in a sad way, how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Everyone assumes betrayal announces itself somehow, that you'd feel it coming. But it rarely does. It just wears a familiar face and goes on doing familiar things, right up until the very last moment. The familiar face here was Dr. Wellington Yue. You remember him. Quiet, careful, devoted. The man with the diamond tattoo on his forehead marking him as a graduate of the Souk Medical School. The kind of mark that was supposed to mean he could never, ever cause harm to a patient. That was the whole point of it. It was meant to be unbreakable. And in a way, it still held true right up until someone found the one thing in this universe that could break a Sook doctor's conditioning anyway, which wasn't money and wasn't fear for himself. It was his wife. Wana, taken by the Harkonnens, held somewhere he couldn't reach, and he was told, quite simply, that if he helped them get to Duke Leto, she might be spared. I don't think he ever really believed that promise. I think some small, exhausted part of him knew it was a lie even as he was choosing to believe it, because it was the only thing left for him to hold on to. That's what makes it so sad, rather than simply villainous. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a broken one, doing a terrible thing for a reason that, in some quiet corner of your heart, you can almost understand. No notes on that, really, just an old kind of sorrow. So it was Yua who disabled the household shields on the night the attack came. Yua who left a door unlocked that should have stayed locked. Yua who, in the end, would slip something into the Duke's own tooth, a false tooth, packed with poison gas, and tell him, in his final moments of usefulness to the plot, to bite down on it when he was close enough to the Baron to matter. A last secret gift offered with trembling hands to a man he had betrayed and still, somehow, loved. And on Arrakis, that night, the sky over Arrakeen simply opened. The Harkonnens came back in force, and this time they didn't come alone. Emperor Shaddam IV had lent them his Sardaukar, his terrible, silent, elite legions, dressed in Harkonnen colors so that no one could later prove the Emperor's own hand in it. That's worth sitting with for a moment, if you're not too tired. The idea that the person who was supposed to be the neutral authority over all the great houses was the one who made sure House Atreides could never survive the night. It tells you something about how this whole universe worked. Power protecting power, and everyone else just living or dying in the space underneath. The household shields, the ones that should have stopped a direct assault cold, simply weren't there when it mattered, and so the sky that had always been a kind of ceiling, a kind of safety, let everything through. Ships came down low over the palace. Fire came with them, and you have to picture it not as chaos and noise, because from where we're sitting now, so far away from it, it plays more like something slow and terrible and inevitable, like watching weather move in over a coastline you love, knowing there's nothing anyone in its path can do. Duke Leto tried anyway. That's the part of him I've always loved best, if I'm honest. He wasn't a naive man. He'd known for a long time that Arrakis was a gift wrapped around a blade, that the Emperor and the Baron between them had built something no honorable man could really win. And still, when the moment came, he stood in it. He tried to get his people out. He tried to buy time for Paul and Jessica. He held himself like a duke, even as the walls of his own house were burning down around him, and there is something in that, a kind of stubborn, doomed dignity that I find quietly beautiful, even now, even having told this story so many times. He was captured, in the end. Of course he was. There was no version of that night where he wasn't. And the Baron Harkonnen, fat and pleased and cruel in the particular unhurried way of a man who has waited years for this exact moment, had him brought before him so that he could look at what he'd finally won. That's when Yue's last gift mattered. Leto, weakened, poisoned already with something meant to slow him, still had that false tooth waiting in his mouth, and the plan, the doctor's whispered, desperate plan, was that he might get close enough to the Baron to end it there, in one breath, in one bite. Leto tried. He got close. He bit down. And it almost worked. I want you to hold on to that for a second, because it matters. It very nearly did. The gas went out into the room. People died from it. But the Baron didn't. He was pulled back in time by someone quicker, and so Duke Leto Atreides, who had tried everything, right up to his very last living choice, to take his enemies down with him, died there instead, alone in that room, having failed at the one final act of defiance he had left. I think that's the quiet heartbreak at the center of this whole part of the story. Not that he lost, because in some sense he was always going to lose, but that even his last act of courage wasn't quite enough. And yet, it was still an act of courage. It still counted. It still tells you who he was. Yua didn't get to see any of what came after. Not really. He'd already been found out, already paid for what he'd done, and whatever comfort he'd hoped for, some quiet reunion with his Wana, some proof that his terrible choice had bought her safety, never came. It was always going to be a lie. I think some part of him always knew that too. And Paul and Jessica, this is the part I want to leave you with for now. Softly, they weren't killed outright. The Baron, or perhaps it was simply cruelty dressed up as caution, decided instead to have them driven out into the deep desert, out past the last edges of anything, and left there. A little fuel, a little water, a suspensor copter set down in the open sand, and then nothing. Just the dark and the dunes, and the two of them alone in it, expected to die quietly, without a mark on anyone, out where the desert itself would take the blame. It must have felt like the absolute bottom of everything. Everything taken in a single night. Home, house, father, safety, the whole shape of the life Paul had been raised to expect. Just the sand now, and the wind starting to move over it, and two people standing very small underneath a sky that didn't care one way or another what happened to them next. But the desert, as it turns out, doesn't always finish what it starts. And I'll let that thought sit here quietly with you for now, because there's more to come, and none of it needs to be rushed. Just rest with this part a while. Let the sand settle. We'll keep going soon, slowly, the way we always do. And from there, if you're still with me, if your eyes are already half closed, let's go into the storm together, because that's where they went. Paul and his mother didn't run toward safety. There wasn't any safety left to run toward. They ran toward the one thing on Arrakis that everyone else feared enough to leave alone, and that was the wall of the storm itself. That great slow wave of sand climbing into the sky, tall as mountains, moving with a patience that had nothing to do with anger. And I think that's worth sitting with for a second. They chose the storm on purpose, not because they were brave in the way we usually mean that word, but because everything behind them was worse. They took a small ornithopter up into it, and I won't dwell on the mechanics of it, the wings folding and unfolding to catch what lift they could, because that's not really the point of this part of the story. The point is the feeling of it. Being inside something that big, riding the Coriolis winds, which is just a fancy way of saying the storm had its own weather inside its weather, currents within currents, and if you found the right one, if you let it carry you instead of fighting it, it could actually save your life instead of ending it. So they rode it. Sand hissing against the hull like static, the light gone strange and orange, and then gone entirely, and the two of them just holding on, trusting a machine and a little bit of luck, and each other. There's something almost tender in that, isn't there? A mother and her son, inside a storm that could kill them in 100 casual ways, and the only thing left to do is hold still and breathe. They came down eventually, the way you always eventually come down, hard and rough but alive, out on the open sand somewhere in the deep desert, past the last places even the Fremen usually bothered to go. And this is where I want to slow down even more than I already have, because something happens to Paul out there that I think is the real hinge of this whole story. Not the storm, not the escape. What happens inside him? He'd been breathing spice-laden air for weeks by then, eating spice-laced food without even knowing it half the time, the way everyone on Arrakis does, and it had been building up in him quietly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a glass. And out there, alone with his mother in the deep desert, away from the noise of the world, it finally reached him all the way. I don't mean that as a small thing. I mean his mind cracked open. Cracked open the way a door does when you've been leaning on it your whole life without knowing it was ever closed. He started to see, not one future, but all of them, or something close to all of them, branching out ahead of him like the veins of a leaf, thousands of paths, most of them ending in blood. And he was in the middle of every single one. He saw green places that didn't exist yet. He saw himself old, and he saw himself barely older than he was right then, already dead in some of the branches. And running through nearly all of it, like a current he couldn't swim against, was a war. A vast one. Armies moving in his name across worlds he hadn't even heard of yet. A kind of holy fury spreading out from this desert planet in every direction, and it would use his face to do it, his name, whether he wanted that or not. He called it the terrible purpose, later in his own mind, and I think that's exactly right. Because purpose can be a heavy thing to carry, heavier than having no purpose at all. He didn't want it. That's important, I think, and easy to lose in a story this big. He wasn't hungry for power out there in the sand. He was 15 years old, terrified, half sick from what the spice was doing to him. And what he saw waiting for him in his own future frightened him more than the storm had. A jihad. Billions of lives bending around him like light around something heavy. He saw it coming the way you see weather coming, and he couldn't find a way to stop it, only ways to shape it a little, and even that wasn't much comfort. You don't have to hold on to any of that too tightly, by the way. Just let the feeling of it sit with you a moment. A boy discovering he can see too much, and none of what he sees is easy. His mother went through her own version of it beside him, quieter, her mind touching something ancient and female that had been waiting inside her all along. Generations of women who came before her, folding into her awareness, almost gently, all at once. It's a lot for anyone to carry in a single night in the open desert. And still, somehow, they kept going. Not far behind them, back where the fighting still hadn't quite finished, Duncan Idaho made his choice. He'd trained for this in a way, though nobody ever really trains for the actual moment. He held a line so that others could get away, so that Paul and Jessica would have a little more time and a little more distance, and he did it without any hesitation that I've ever heard described. Just a plain, steady kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He didn't win. He wasn't going to win. But he bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered that night, and he spent all of his on people he loved. I find that quietly one of the most moving parts of the whole story, if I'm honest with you. No speeches, just a man staying so others could leave. And then, out on the sand, worn down to almost nothing, Paul and Jessica were found. Not rescued, exactly, though it amounted to the same thing. Found by a band of Fremen, moving through the deep desert the way they always moved. Quiet, watchful, at home in a place that killed almost everyone else who tried to live there. Their leader was a man named Stilgar, and I'll tell you more about him as we go, because he matters a great deal to what comes next, But for now, it's enough to know this. He looked at the two of them, exhausted, sand-worn, barely standing, and he didn't turn away. He saw something in Paul, something he couldn't quite name yet, and he let them come along instead of leaving them to the desert the way the desert usually insists on. So that's where we'll leave them for a moment. Not safe, not really, not yet. But not alone anymore either. Walking now instead of running. And somewhere ahead of them, out past the dunes, a whole world of people living quietly under the sand, waiting, without knowing it yet, for exactly this. So let them rest a moment in the deep desert, the two of them small against all that sand, because what comes next is really a kind of homecoming, even if it doesn't look like one at first. I always think it's strange to call a stretch of rock and sand a home, but that's what Sietch Tabr becomes for Paul and Jessica, and I want to walk through it slowly with you, because there's so much tenderness hidden inside what looks, from the outside, like a hard and unforgiving life. You remember Stilgar already, the Fremen leader with the quiet authority, the one who first found them stumbling through the open desert. It would have been easy for him to leave them, or worse, to take their water the way the old Fremen law almost demanded. But he doesn't. Something in him hesitates, and that hesitation matters more than it seems, because it's the crack through which everything else gets in. He brings them instead into the Sietch, down into that hidden warren carved into the rock, where hundreds of Fremen live pressed close together, sharing air, sharing water, sharing a discipline so total it's almost invisible until you understand what it costs them. You don't have to memorize the layout of the place, the different chambers, who sleeps where. Just picture it as I do, a soft, low hum of lamplight, damp stone, the sound of people moving quietly, because sound and moisture are both precious here. It's not glamorous, it's careful. Everything is careful. And into that carefulness comes Chani. I love this part, honestly. She's Fremen, young, sharp, already skilled with a blade, and she watches Paul the way someone watches a stranger they're not sure they trust yet. With interest, with a kind of wary curiosity. There's no lightning bolt here, no dramatic declaration. It's slower than that, and I think that's exactly why it works. They start as something like rivals, testing each other, and only gradually does that testing soften into something warmer. If you've ever watched two careful people fall for each other without either one admitting it out loud, you know the shape of this. I won't rush it, and neither does the story. Let it just settle over you, the way it settled over them. One shared look, one shared silence. One moment where Paul realizes he'd rather be near her than anywhere else, long before he'd say so. But before any of that can really take root, Paul has to be accepted. Not welcomed, exactly, accepted, which is a much harder thing among the Fremen. There are trials. There's suspicion. Some of them want to kill him outright, because he's an outsider, because outsiders are expensive to protect, and this is a people who cannot afford expense. Stilgar vouches for him, again and again, spending some of his own standing to do it. And Paul, to his credit, doesn't try to talk his way past their doubt. He fights for it, a little at a time, and he listens, which matters just as much. He learns to move without wasting motion. He learns to read the sand the way they do, the subtle signs of a coming storm, the deep, low warning of a worm beneath the surface. Slowly, he becomes someone they can imagine living among them, rather than someone they're merely tolerating. And with that acceptance comes a name, actually two, Among the Fremen, everyone earns a private name and often a public one too, and Paul is given his private name Usul, meaning something like the strength of the base of the pillar, the quiet. Hidden strength that holds everything else up. I find that lovely, that they'd choose a name about foundations for a boy who arrived with nothing. And then he chooses his own public name, the one he'll be known by more widely, drawing it from the small desert mouse, the kangaroo mouse, called Muad'Dib. It's an animal the Fremen respect, one that knows how to survive in the harshest place in the universe by being clever rather than strong, by adapting rather than fighting the desert head-on. So he becomes, to the wider world, Paul Muad'Dib. Usul in private, among those who know him closest. Muad'Dib in public, the name that will travel, whether he wants it to or not. You don't need to carry the weight of what that name will eventually mean. Not tonight. For now, it's simply a boy earning a place, a young man being folded, thread by thread, into a community that asks everything of its members, and in exchange, keeps them alive in a place that should be uninhabitable. There's something almost domestic in it, if you squint. Shared meals, quiet lessons, small kindnesses traded quietly between people who have very little to spare. I think that's the part outsiders miss about the Fremen, how much gentleness lives inside all that discipline. Meanwhile, something else is happening, something quieter still, and it belongs to Jessica. She takes on the role of a kind of spiritual leader among the Fremen, and to do that fully, to become what they call a reverend mother, she has to undergo their ritual, drinking the water of life, a poison drawn from a drowned sandworm, something that would kill an ordinary person outright. Only someone trained the way the Bene Gesserit train can survive it, transmuting the poison from the inside, turning it into something the body can hold rather than something that kills it. Here's the part I find almost unbearably moving, so let it land softly. Jessica is pregnant at the time, carrying Paul's little sister, not yet born, not yet named. And when Jessica takes the poison into herself and begins that inward transformation, it reaches the unborn child too. It wakes her. It gives her, somehow, the same awareness, the same terrible clarity, the same flood of ancestral memory that floods into any reverend mother, except she receives it before she's even drawn a single breath of outside air. Alia, still curled inside her mother, becomes conscious, aware, ancient, all at once, without ever having had the chance to simply be a baby first. I don't think there's a tidy way to feel about that. It's a kind of miracle, and a kind of wound in the very same breath, and I've always found it one of the quietly devastating threads in this whole story. A child who never gets an ordinary beginning, who arrives already carrying more than any child should carry. No notes, as I said before. Just let that one sit with you a moment, gently, without needing to resolve it. So there they are, mother and son, both changed, both reshaped by this desert and its unforgiving mercy. Paul with a new name, and a girl beside him he's only just beginning to understand his feelings for. Jessica with new sight, and a daughter not yet born who already carries the weight of it too. The sietch settles into its low hum around them. The lamps dim. The sand outside goes on breathing in its slow, terrible rhythm, and somewhere further out, past all this quiet, the wider story keeps turning, patient, unhurried, waiting for morning that in this world hardly ever comes gently. And somewhere in those long, folded months of learning to walk without rhythm, of learning to read the wind and the color of the sky before a storm, Paul came to the part of Fremen life that I think most people picture first when they think of this story at all. The worms. Riding them. Calling one of those enormous, ancient creatures up out of the deep sand and standing on its back like it was the most natural thing in the world. I want to go slowly here, because it's such a strange and beautiful piece of the story, and there's no need to rush any of it. You have to understand, calling a worm isn't something you do on a whim. The Fremen had turned it into something between a craft and a ceremony, quiet and practiced, passed down so long that nobody really remembers who worked it out first. You plant a thumper in the sand, a simple little device that just beats, over and over, a rhythm into the ground. And you walk away from it without disturbing the sand yourself, and you wait. And somewhere down in that ocean of dunes, something enormous feels it. Feels that small, wrong, rhythmic pulse, and comes. Paul had seen it done before he ever tried it himself. He'd watched Stilgar's people do it with this offhand confidence, this ease that comes only from a lifetime of practice, and I imagine that from the outside it must have looked almost like nothing at all. A person standing very still, holding two hooks, waiting for the sand to rise. But underneath that stillness is an entire language. Where to stand, how to read the faint hiss and shift of sand that tells you the worm is close, and closer, and now. When to plant the hooks, those maker hooks, curved and sharp, into the worm's leading edge, at the rings, in that one small margin of its enormous body where the hooks will actually hold and the segment will roll open just enough to keep the sensitive inner flesh away from the sand, away from friction and light, which is the only reason the worm ever surfaces to ride on top of the dune at all, instead of pulling itself straight back under. And I love that detail, honestly, that the entire practice of riding a sandworm is built out of understanding the worm's discomfort. You're not taming it. You're just finding the one true, narrow thing that makes it want to stay up on the surface instead of diving, and you use that, gently, the way you'd use a truth about someone rather than a trick. It's such a Fremen way of doing things, not conquering the desert, just listening to it closely enough that it lets you ride along for a while. Paul's first time doing it himself, by every account, went about the way you'd expect for someone doing something this enormous for the first time. A little rough, a little too much muscle where patience would have served him better. The worm's whole vast body curling and rolling beneath him in a way that could easily throw a person clear off into the sand. But he stayed on, and you have to remember what Paul was. Underneath the boy who was still learning, he'd been trained since before he could really talk in the discipline of his own body. The Bene Gesserit way of moving and breathing and reading the world through muscle and balance. And on top of that, his mother had given him the beginnings of the voice. And the Mentat training from Thufir Hawat had given him a mind that could take in 100 small signals and turn them into a single clear next action almost before he knew he was thinking. So when it came to holding on to a sandworm, to reading a rhythm that would kill an untrained person in about 4 seconds, some deep part of him already knew how to learn fast. And he did learn fast. Within a season, he could call a worm, mount it, ride it for miles across the open erg, and bring it around to a stop or a turn, with the same easy, unhurried confidence he'd watched in Stilgar. The Fremen noticed. Of course they noticed. A man who could ride the worm like that wasn't just accepted anymore. He was becoming something else in their eyes, something they already had a name waiting for. Because while all of this was happening, the training, the learning, the slow physical becoming of a true man of the desert, Paul was also doing something much more dangerous with his days. He was leading raids. Small, sharp, careful strikes against the Harkonnen spice operations scattered across Arrakis, the harvesters and the crawlers, and the little outposts that kept the melange flowing off-world into the hands of the people who had murdered his father. And I think it's worth sitting with how strange that must have felt for him. A duke's son, raised in courtyards and war rooms, now moving across open sand at night with Stilgar's fighters, striking fast and vanishing back into the dunes before the Harkonnens could even properly answer. But it worked. Raid after raid, it worked. Because the Fremen already knew how to disappear into their own desert, and now they had, riding with them, a young man whose instincts for strategy were sharpening into something almost frightening. A Mentat's mind for tactics wedded to a warrior's education, and underneath all of it, that other thing. The thing he could never quite set down. The visions. Because this is where it gets complicated, and I want to be gentle with this part, because it's the part that I think troubled Paul the most. Every raid that worked, every Harkonnen spice run that burned in the desert night, every story that traveled afterward from sietch to sietch about the outsider who could call worms and vanish into sand like he'd been born to it, all of it fed something. A name. Muad'Dib. The little desert mouse, the one who knows how to live in this place. And underneath that name, older and heavier, the word the Fremen had been waiting centuries to attach to somebody, Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the one the prophecy had promised them. And Paul knew, better than any of them, exactly how that prophecy had gotten there in the first place. He knew the Bene Gesserit had planted it, generations before he was born, seeding these desert people with a legend so that one day, if one of their own ever needed shelter here, the ground would already be prepared to receive him as something holy. So imagine carrying that. Imagine watching people's eyes change when they looked at you, watching them start to believe you were the answer to something ancient and sacred, while some quiet, aching part of you knew exactly how manufactured that belief really was. And knew, too, in flashes he couldn't always control, where all of this might be leading. Not just to safety, not just to revenge, but outward, past Arrakis entirely, into something vast and burning that moved in his visions like fire moving through dry grass, carrying his name at the front of it. He didn't want that future. And yet every raid, every story, every worm ride under the stars was walking him one step closer to it. Gently, the way sand shifts, one grain at a time, until the whole dune has moved. I'll leave him there for now, out under that huge desert sky, becoming exactly what everyone around him needed him to be, and quietly grieving, in some private corner of himself, the parts of that becoming he never chose. I want to slow down even more for this part, if that's all right. This is one of the strange, heavy centers of the whole story, and I don't want to rush through it just because it's intense. You can let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. Nothing here needs watching, only listening. By this point, Paul has been living among the Fremen for a while. He has a name now that isn't the one he was born with, Usul, in the sietch, among friends, and out in the open desert, where the stories about him are starting to grow bigger than he is. He's becoming known as Muad'Dib. He has a wife in every way that matters, Chani, and a mother who has become something like a priestess, and a war brewing under the sand that he can feel coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. And still, there's something unfinished in him. Something the Bene Gesserit spent centuries breeding toward, generation after careful generation, that hasn't fully arrived yet. He has visions, He has glimpses of the future, bright and broken, like light through moving water. But he hasn't stepped all the way through. Not yet. The Fremen have a ritual for this. A terrible one, honestly, and I say that gently, because it is genuinely one of the darker images in the whole story, and I don't want to pretend otherwise, even at this hour. There is a poison the Fremen call the water of life. It comes from a sandworm, specifically from a small worm, a young one, drowned deliberately in water, which is the one thing that can kill it, and what comes out of that drowning is toxic beyond almost anything else in the universe. It is the same substance, in a raw, more lethal form, that the Reverend Mothers of the Bene Gesserit have learned to transmute inside their own bodies, turning poison into something sacred, something that opens the mind backward through generations of memory. Only women have ever done this. It's one of the deepest truths of their order, one of the walls they've built around their own power, and one of the reasons the whole Bene Gesserit breeding program existed in the first place, to produce, eventually, a man who could do it too. A man who could hold both sides. That was always the point of the Kwisatz Haderach, if you go all the way back to the beginning of this story. Someone who could go where only women had gone. So Paul drinks it. He doesn't have to be talked into it, not really. There's a pull toward this moment that's been building the whole time we've been walking through his story together, and I think some part of him has known for a while that he was walking toward this exact night. His mother, Jessica, pregnant at this point with his sister, the one who will be born already awake, already aware. In a way that still quietly unsettles me every time I sit with it, his mother is there. And when he drinks the poison, he doesn't survive it easily. He drops. His body goes rigid, and then still. And for a long, long stretch, he is somewhere between alive and not, in a kind of death that isn't quite death, a trance so deep the people around him aren't sure which way it's going to break. I want to just sit in that image for a moment, because I think it's one of the quietest, strangest parts of the whole saga. Here is this young man, lying in the dim gold light of the Sietch, surrounded by people who love him, and people who are still deciding whether to trust him, and he is, for all anyone can tell, dying. Chani is there. There's real fear in that room. Not the fear of a battle, which is loud and clear and has an obvious shape. This is the other kind. The quiet kind. The not knowing kind. And I find that stillness more frightening, honestly, than almost anything violent that happens later in this story. Nothing to fight. Just waiting. But inside that stillness, something else is happening. Paul isn't dying. Not exactly. He's transmuting the poison, doing internally what the Reverend Mothers do, turning the toxin harmless the way water turns to something else entirely when it changes temperature. Except this is happening inside a mind, inside a body, inside a young man who has spent his whole short life being prepared, without ever fully knowing it, for precisely this, and where the Reverend Mothers can look backward into the memory of every woman who came before them in an unbroken chain. Paul can look both ways, backward and forward, male and female lines both, all the way through. That's the thing that was missing before, the thing that had never existed in one person. And when he does it, when he survives the crossing, he wakes up seeing differently than he ever has before. This is where the Kwisatz Haderach is, properly, fully born, not a metaphor anymore. Paul opens his eyes, and time isn't a single line to him the way it is to the rest of us. He can see it more like, I don't know, an ocean maybe, or a landscape you could walk in more than one direction. Countless futures, branching and folding over each other, some collapsing into others, most of them ending in fire and ruin. A very few of them narrow and difficult and threading through to something that might, just might, be survivable. He calls it, later, the narrow way. The golden path is still ahead of him, further down the road than we need to go tonight. But this is where he first properly sees the shape of what's coming. And here's the part I find hardest, and also somehow the most honest thing in the whole story. Almost every path he sees, every single one, leads toward a war spreading out from him across the galaxy. Not just a war he fights, a war fought in his name, by people who believe he is something more than a man, sweeping outward long after he's stopped being able to control it. An ocean of blood is how he thinks of it. That phrase has always stayed with me. Not a battle, an ocean. And so he wakes from that trance, not triumphant, not glowing with power the way you might expect from a story like this. He wakes quieter, heavier, because now he knows. He has the sight he was always meant to have, and what it shows him isn't victory in any clean sense. It's a narrow path forward, through so much loss, with almost every other road leading somewhere worse. That's the terrible bargain buried in the middle of all this. Power arriving at exactly the same moment as the full weight of what it will cost. I've always thought that was one of the most honest things Frank Herbert ever put into this story. Being chosen isn't a gift here. It's a burden with visions attached. So let that image rest with you for a while. Paul lying still in the dark of the Sietch, crossing over and coming back changed, opening his eyes onto 1,000 branching futures. You don't need to hold the details, just the shape of it. The boy in the desert who becomes, in one long, quiet night, something the galaxy has never quite had before. And from here, slowly, we'll follow where that narrow path begins to lead him. And from there, slowly, something begins to gather in the desert. Not all at once, not with any trumpet or announcement, but the way a dune gathers itself grain by grain, until one day it simply isn't the same shape anymore. I want to sit with you in this part for a while, because it's one of my favorite stretches of the whole story, even though it's full of war. There's something in it that always moves me, and I think it's this. A boy who was given nothing but grief becomes, slowly, without ever really choosing it in the way you'd choose a coat off a rack, the person an entire people had been waiting centuries for. Paul is Muad'Dib now, more than he is Paul, though I'll keep calling him Paul with you sometimes, just because it's gentler, just because somewhere in there the frightened boy is still real too. And Muad'Dib does the thing that no outsider before him ever managed. He unites the Fremen. Not just a Sietch here, a Sietch there, trading water discipline and old grudges the way desert people had always done, holding their fierce, separate pride even against a common enemy. He brings them together as one force, one will, under one banner, and he does it partly through what he is, Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, the fulfillment of a prophecy that had been planted generations before, quietly, carefully, by the Bene Gesserit, like seeds pressed into sand so far in advance that no one alive remembers the planting. And I always find that detail a little haunting, if I'm honest, that the very belief that makes him unstoppable was built by someone else's hands long before he was born, for entirely different reasons. You don't have to hold on to that thought. Just let it sit there a moment, and then let it go. But it isn't only prophecy that does it. It's Paul himself, walking among them, learning their ways instead of demanding they learn his, drinking the recycled water of the stillsuits, learning to ride the great worms the way they do, earning the name Usul in the Sietch, earning it slowly, the way trust is always earned, one small honest act after another. The Fremen had always been warriors, they'd had to be, just to survive a planet that kills the careless and rewards the disciplined, but scattered, they were only ever a nuisance to the Empire, a cost of doing business, a reason to keep extra troops on Arrakis. United, under Paul, they become something else entirely. An army, a wave, and what they do first, before anything else, is choke the spice. I want to go slowly here, because this is the part where you start to feel, in your body more than your mind, how much power flows through something as small and strange as a spoonful of orange-brown dust. Paul understands, the way his father Duke Leto once understood in flashes, and the way the Baron never truly understood at all, that Arrakis isn't just a planet, and melange isn't just a spice. It's the thing that lets the Guild's navigators fold space and move ships between the stars. It's the thing that keeps the Bene Gesserit sharp, that keeps the wealthy young, that keeps the whole vast machine of the Imperium turning over, day after day, without anyone in a soft chair on a soft world ever thinking too hard about where it comes from. Paul thinks about where it comes from. He knows the harvesters, the spice blows, the crawlers out on the open sand, and so the Fremen begin to hit them, not everywhere at once, not loudly, but relentlessly, the way sand gets into everything eventually, wearing down what it touches. Harvesters destroyed, convoys ambushed, the great slow machinery of extraction picked apart night after night by riders who seem to rise up out of the dunes themselves and vanish back into them before the sun is even properly up. And here's the part I find quietly devastating, in the gentlest way I can say it. This is exactly what Paul foresaw, back when the visions used to come to him unbidden and unwelcome, back when he was still just a frightened young man on a ship leaving Caladan. He saw a jihad. He saw fire spreading out from this desert into every corner of civilized space, carried on the back of religious fervor he never fully wanted to summon. And now here it is, arriving anyway, exactly as feared, because it turns out some rivers, once you start them running, don't much care what you wanted from them. You don't need to carry that weight tonight. Just notice it, softly, and let your shoulders drop a little. Meanwhile, on the ground, it's Rabban who has to answer for all of it. Poor, brutal Rabban, the Baron's nephew, left behind to hold Arrakis with an iron fist and not nearly enough imagination to see what's coming. He raises taxes, he tightens the grip, he does the only thing he knows how to do, which is squeeze harder, and of course it doesn't work, because you cannot squeeze sand. It only slips through your fingers faster. The harvests fail. The garrisons bleed. Reports go back to Giedi Prime and then on to the Emperor's court on Kaitain, each one a little more desperate than the last, and each one a little less believed, because who wants to believe that a rabble of desert nomads is bringing the spice production of the entire Imperium to its knees? But it is. It genuinely is, and I have to say, there is something almost peaceful in watching cruelty finally run out of road, even from a safe, sleepy distance like this one. And so it reaches all the way up, past Rabban, past the Baron, all the way to Shaddam IV himself, sitting on the golden lion throne, who cannot pretend any longer that this is a local matter to be handled by lesser men. The spice is the Empire's lifeblood, and the lifeblood is failing, and that means the Emperor himself has to come. Not a governor, not a fleet commander. Him, and he brings his Sardaukar with him, the fiercest soldiers in the known universe, the ones who are supposed to end any fight the moment they arrive. And because a moment this large cannot stay quiet, the great houses come too, in their ships, gathering in orbit above Arrakis to watch, some hoping to see Paul crushed, some hoping, secretly, to see the old order shaken loose at last. So there they all are, slowly converging on that one dry, burning world, drawn there the way all of them, in the end, are drawn there, by the spice, by the prophecy, by a storm that's been building since long before any of them were born. You don't need to hold the shape of what's coming. Just know that it's coming slowly, the way all true storms come. And that, for now, everything is still just gathering itself in the quiet dark, grain by grain by grain. The storm was already moving before anyone in Arrakis understood what it carried. I think that's the part I find most quietly astonishing, actually, that the very weather of Arrakis, the thing that had always been the planet's harshest warning, became the thing that hid Paul's army as it came. You don't need to hold on to the mechanics of it. Just picture it with me. A Coriolis storm, vast and grinding, moving in off the open desert, and somewhere inside all that blown sand, riding low, are worms. Enormous ones, ridden by Fremen who have waited their whole lives, or their parents' whole lives, for this. And ahead of them, planted in the shield wall itself, is a gift from the smugglers and the old ways of the desert, atomics, the family weapons the Atreides were never supposed to use against a shield, saved for exactly this kind of last, quiet, terrible necessity. And they go off. The wall that was supposed to be permanent, that had stood between the deep desert and the city for as long as anyone could remember, opens like something that was only ever pretending to be solid. I always slow down here, because it deserves that. Not for the spectacle of it, I'm not going to dwell on the fire or the noise, but for the strangeness of what it means. The wall breaks, and the storm comes through the gap, and the worms come through the storm, and on the worms are the people the Empire had spent decades calling savages. You can let the rest of it stay soft focus, the way I always do with this part. Sardaukar, the Emperor's own terrible soldiers, the ones who were never supposed to lose, meeting Fremen in the streets and the open ground around the city, and finding, maybe for the first time in their long unbeaten history, that they are the ones who are afraid. There's no glory in it the way old stories sometimes pretend battles have glory. It's just quick, and it's over. And by the time the dust starts to answer to the wind again, the army that once made emperors kneel has been broken on a planet everyone thought was worthless. I find that detail, worthless, they called it, this planet, spice and sand and nothing else, quietly devastating now, at the end. It was never worthless, it just wasn't understood. And so, in the ruins and the quiet after, Paul walks in, not as a general exactly, and not only as Muad'Dib, the name the Fremen gave him, the desert mouse who knows how to survive. He walks in as Paul Atreides, son of a duke who was murdered in this same house. And he walks in already knowing, in that terrible clear way he has of knowing things before they happen, more or less how this next part will go. The Emperor is brought to him. Shaddam IV, who once thought he could use this planet and this family and quietly discard them both, standing now in the wreckage of a plan he was so sure of. I won't spend long here on what passes between them, because you don't need the details to feel the shape of it. An old, tired, frightened man, meeting the boy he tried to destroy, only the boy isn't a boy anymore, and isn't entirely tender about it either. And there is Fade Rotha. I think this is a moment worth resting in for just a second, gently, because it's the last time in this story that two men will settle something the old way, blade to blade, in a circle, with everyone watching and nobody able to look away. Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, vicious, beautiful in his own cruel fashion, trained his whole life for exactly this kind of moment, sure of his own skill in the way that people are right before it fails them. And Paul, who has walked through fire and grief and years compressed into visions, who has lost his father and very nearly lost himself, faces him. It isn't long. These things rarely are, in the end, however long they've been building. And when it's over, it's Paul standing there, breathing hard, maybe, in a silence that has just swallowed the last living Harkonnen who mattered. No notes, as I like to say. That whole poisoned, cruel line, finished, quietly, in a room, instead of on a page of history the way it always imagined itself ending. So the throne, in a very real sense, is just sitting there afterward, waiting for someone to claim it, and Paul does. He does it the way these things have always been done among the great houses, not just by winning a war, but by marriage, by binding one line to another so the piece has a shape everyone can recognize. He takes Irulan's hand, the emperor's daughter, clever and watchful, who becomes his wife in every way that matters to history, and in almost no way that matters to his heart, because his heart, the part of him that is just Paul, and not Muad'Dib, and not the Emperor of 1,000 worlds, stays with Chani. I always feel for both of them here gently, without picking sides, because I don't think this story wants us to pick sides. Chani, who loved him in the desert, plainly, without titles. And Irulan, who will spend the rest of her life writing down the history of a man who never really let her in. It's a quiet kind of sadness tucked inside a coronation. You don't have to untangle all of it tonight. Just let it sit there, the way these bittersweet things do, true and a little sorrowful at the same time. And you would think, wouldn't you, that this is where it settles, a wedding, a throne, an empire that finally bows. But the great houses, the old families who have run things for so many thousands of years, do not bow easily, and some of them do not bow at all. They look at this man from a minor house, raised up out of desert and prophecy and war, holding both the spice and the loyalty of the most feared fighters in the galaxy, and they refuse him, quietly at first, and then not quietly. And Paul, who has seen this coming for so long, in dream after dream, who dreaded exactly this the whole time he was becoming what everyone needed him to become, feels it start to move anyway, the way a landslide starts to move, slowly, and then all at once, and then not stoppable by anyone, including him. The jihad he feared, the holy war carried by his name into 1,000 futures he never wanted, begins to spread out from this one broken planet into all the others. Not tonight, not in this telling. That's further down the road than we're going to walk right now. But it's there, already starting, the way weather starts, before you feel the first drop of rain. So let's leave him here, if you can, just for now. Standing in the quiet after a battle, married to one woman, loving another, an empire technically at his feet, and a future he can already half see stretching out ahead of him, vast and uncertain and not entirely his to control anymore. The desert outside Arrakis has gone still again, the way it always does, indifferent to what just happened on it. That's where this part of the story rests. Everything after this, everything that comes next for Paul, and for Chani, and for the war that's only just beginning to breathe, that's its own telling, for another night in Dune Part 3. For now, just let the sand settle, Let the quiet come back in. You don't have to hold on to any of it. Just rest. And that's where I'll leave Arrakis for tonight, the sand still settling, the centuries still turning slowly behind us, long after we've stopped watching. I want to just step outside the story for a moment, back into my own voice, and thank you. Genuinely, thank you for staying with me through all of it. The worms and the water discipline, the exiles and the empires, the long, quiet stretches where nothing much happened except time passing, the way it always does out there. That's a lot of centuries to sit through in the dark, and if you made it this far with me, I'm grateful. Honestly though, I have a feeling most of you are already asleep by now. And that's exactly right. That's the whole idea. If you drifted off somewhere back around the second moon, or the third house, or you don't even remember, good. That was the plan all along. There's no quiz waiting for you in the morning. But if by some chance you're still here, still awake, still listening, hello, you night owl. The next story is already sitting there waiting for you, whenever you want it. No rush. And if a video like this has ever helped you get some rest, a like or a subscribe just helps other tired people find their way here too. Only if you feel like it. Truly, no pressure at all. For now though, just let it all go. Let the sand settle. Let your shoulders settle too. I hope you sleep deep and easy tonight, and I hope if you dream at all, you dream of open desert under 2 moons, quiet and endless, and yours alone. Good night.